The Vantral engineer held Mara Holt's torque wrench between two clawed fingers like it was something he'd found stuck to his boot, turned it slowly under the work lights, and said, in the flat translated voice the ship gave him, that he had not realized Earth still permitted its citizens to carry farm implements onto starships. Mara didn't look up from the coupling. "It's a wrench." "Yes," the Vantral said, "I am aware." Behind him, 3 more of his crew had stopped what they were doing to watch, which was the whole problem with the last 40 minutes. Every time she pulled a new tool out of her kit, work in the bay slowed by another notch, because apparently nothing on this ship was funnier to a Vantral than a human doing something manually. She had 6 hours before the coupling failed outright and took auxiliary power with it, and she'd spent the first 40 minutes of that window being a comedy act. She kept turning the bolt. 2 days earlier she'd been standing in a hangar in Nevada being told, by a man from the State Department who did not look like he believed his own briefing, that the first alien vessel to enter Earth orbit had a mechanical problem it could not fix, that the vessel's owners had specifically requested. After scanning Earth's broadcast spectrum for 6 months and concluding, God knew how, that manual trade skill still existed here, a human structural technician, and that her name had come up because she held 4 heavy fabrication certifications and had spent 9 years hanging steel 40 stories over Pittsburgh without dropping so much as a spanner. She had assumed there would be more of a selection process. There had not been. There had been a physical, a week of orientation nobody actually absorbed, and then a shuttle. Now she was on her back under a coupling assembly the size of a delivery truck, on a deck that hummed under a gravity field she'd been told, twice, was calibrated down specially so she wouldn't collapse, and a Vantral technician named Rensk was holding her wrench up to the light like a museum piece. "It has no field emitter," Rensk said to the others, not to her. "No resonance calibration. It is a metal stick with a metal loop on the end." "It's a 15/16 box end," Mara said. "You put it on the bolt. You turn it. And this achieves what precisely?" "Torque." Rensk made a sound that the translator rendered as something between a cough and a laugh, and didn't try to hide that it was one. "You bring hand tools onto a vessel with active resonance drives, and you call it torque." "I call it fixing your coupling before it takes out your reactor shielding," Mara said, and went back under the housing, because the alternative was looking up and saying something she'd been told, twice, not to say to the people whose ship this was. She heard him relay the wrench comment to someone else in Vantral, unfiltered by the translator, and heard the laugh that came back down the bay. Not a human laugh, lower and slower like gravel settling, but unmistakably a laugh, unmistakably at her. She was aware, distantly, of being the first human being any of these creatures had ever stood next to. She had pictured that moment differently. She had pictured it involving slightly less commentary about her wrench. The coupling itself was straightforward. Once she'd stopped waiting for someone to hand her a scanner that would tell her what was wrong and just put her hand flat against the housing instead, the way she would on a strained girder, feeling for the vibration that didn't belong. It was there, a stutter under her palm, off by a half-beat from the rest of the drive's hum. Their diagnostics, 6 separate systems, layered redundancies, more processing power than existed on the whole of Earth, she'd bet had flagged the coupling as nominal for 2 straight days while it slowly worked itself apart. She didn't know why. She didn't especially care why. She knew what a bad joint felt like under her hand, and this was one, and no scanner in the galaxy had told them that before a human woman lay down on their deck and touched it. "You're diagnosing by hand," Rensk said, and for the first time there was something under the mockery that wasn't quite mockery. Not respect. Curiosity, maybe. The idea that a hand could outreport a sensor sweet clearly offended something in him more than it interested him, but it had gotten his attention. "I'm diagnosing by hand because your scanner's wrong," Mara said. "It's a harmonic fault, not a structural one. Your instruments are looking for a crack. There isn't a crack yet. There's a rhythm that's about to become one. Silence for a second from the little cluster of Vantral crew. Then Rensk said something in his own language, short and dismissive, and two of the others laughed again, and the mood in the bay went right back to where it had started. "What'd he say?" Mara asked the air, meaning the translator pinned under her collar, a flat little disc the Vantral engineers had handed her at the airlock, with the same expression a person might use handing a child a toy phone. "He said," the translator supplied, in its polite and utterly toneless voice, "that it is fitting that a species from such weak gravity relies on feeling for its answers, since it has never had to build anything that could withstand real weight." Mara lay under the coupling a moment longer than she needed to, screwdriver in hand, looking at nothing. Weak gravity. She'd hear that phrase a great deal more before the week was out, though she didn't know that yet. Right now it was just a word choice that snagged, briefly, on something in her, the same way a burr on a bolt snags a thread before it strips it clean. "Tell him I said thanks for the diagnosis," she said, and went back to work. The Vantral, as a species, ran a little over 2 meters at the shoulder and stood like men built out of railroad ties, thick-plated along the forearms and collar in overlapping bands of hide the color of wet slate, faces broad and flat-boned, eyes set wide and low under a brow ridge that gave every single one of them, without any effort on their part, an expression of mild, permanent contempt. Their homeworld, Mara had been told in her 1 week of orientation by a briefing officer who clearly hadn't believed half of what he was reading off the slide either, pulled better than twice Earth's gravity. 2.5 g, near enough. A world where an adult Vantral could deadlift a compact car for sport and consider it a warm-up. They had been out among the stars, by their own account, for longer than humans had been out of caves, and in that time they had apparently made a habit of the same little theater every time they met a new species dumb enough to have evolved on what they called, without any particular malice, a soft world. Mara didn't get the whole picture in the repair bay. She got it in pieces, over the next 2 days, the way you get most things worth knowing on a job site, not from the foreman, but from the guy next to you who's been there longer and has an opinion about everything. That guy, on the Vantral flagship Ashvane, turned out to be a young engineer named Vren, third in seniority on the drive systems crew, low caste by whatever their ranking system was, and visibly delighted that someone new had shown up for his crewmates to have opinions about instead of him. "They do it every time," Vren told her on her second day, crouched next to her at the base of the coupling housing, while she receded a support bracket that their own tools, apparently, couldn't reach into, a 2-centimeter gap between two structural members that no Vantral hand, built for hauling and crushing rather than for threading a socket wrench between two plates, could get a tool into cleanly. His hands were smaller than Rensk's, more careful, and he watched her work the way she might have watched a good welder as an apprentice, actually paying attention instead of performing. New species, weak world. They bring them aboard, crank the deck gravity up toward Corveth standard just to watch how long they last on their feet, and it becomes the story everyone tells at the next posting. There was a delegation from a world called, I don't have the sound for it in your language, something with clicks collapsed in under a minute on the show deck. Overseer Ajal still brings it up. "Sounds like a nice guy," Mara said, not looking up. "He is our best negotiator," Vren said, which she noted was not the same thing as an answer to what she'd said. "He believes gravity tells you everything you need to know about a species before you ever sit down to talk terms with them. Strong world, strong people, strong terms. Weak world. He didn't finish it. He didn't need to. And Earth's a weak world. 0.63 of Corvath standard," Vren said, like he was quoting a number he'd memorized specifically because it amused him. Weakest first contact world on record, actually. There was some talk in the officers' mess about whether the delegation would even be able to stand up straight once they got here. Mara sat back on her heels and looked at him for a second. 0.63. She did the math without much trouble. She'd spent a decade doing load calculations in her head on a beam 40 stories up with a foreman screaming about deadlines in her ear. This was easier than most of that. And thought about a world where everyone walked around under 2.5 times what she'd grown up under, where houses were built to take that weight and never fall down, where a species evolved teeth and bone and muscle mass to match. She thought about her own body, and what 9 years of steel had put into it that a gravity chart wouldn't show. "You said Overseer Ajal thinks gravity tells him everything," she said. "He does." "He's going to be disappointed," Mara said, and went back to the bracket, and didn't explain what she meant, because she wasn't entirely sure herself yet. Only that something about the phrase weak world had settled into her the way a bad rivet settles into a beam, sitting wrong, waiting for the load that would find it out. Overseer Kethran Ajal came down to the repair bay in person at the end of her second day, which she gathered from the way the whole crew straightened up and went quiet was not a thing he usually did. He was older than the others by whatever standard aged a Vantral, hide gone a paler, chalkier gray along the jaw, the plating over his forearms scarred in places in a way that read, even to someone who'd never seen a Vantral before this week, as the marks of a life that hadn't been spent behind a desk. He didn't come alone. He came with 2 aides and a woman Mara recognized from the shuttle manifest, Deputy Envoy Arthur Penn, 61 years old, gray at the temples, the senior human diplomat aboard, whose entire job for the last 2 days had apparently consisted of being polite to people who found him funny. "Ms. Holt," Ajal said, and the translator gave his voice a flat, deep register that somehow still carried the weight of a man used to being listened to without effort. "I am told the coupling is repaired." "It is." "With a stick." "With a wrench," Mara said, and about 40 minutes I didn't need to spend explaining what a wrench was. Penn, behind Ajal's shoulder, went very still in the particular way of a career diplomat watching a conversation start to slide off the rails he'd spent 2 days laying. Ajal, for his part, looked at her for a long moment with those wide-set, low-lidded eyes, and something in his flat alien face shifted. Not offense, she thought. Interest. The particular interest of a man who had expected a certain kind of joke and gotten a different one instead. "Vren informs me your diagnosis outperformed 6 shipboard sensor arrays," Ajal said. "Vren's got good ears. He also informs me you calculated, unprompted, the gravitational differential between your world and mine." A pause. 0.63, correct to 2 places. Mara wiped her hands on a rag that had 3 hours ago been white. "I work with load a lot, numbers like that stick." "It is a very weak number, Ms. Holt," Ajal said, and there it was again, that phrase, delivered this time not by a young engineer amused at her expense, but by the man in charge of deciding whether Earth got a seat at any table worth sitting at. "Weaker than any world we have brought a delegation up from in 11 cycles. I confess I did not expect the technician sent to service my ship to know the number, let alone to be unbothered by it." "Why would I be bothered by it?" Mara said. "It's not my fault your homeworld's got a bigger rock spinning under it than mine does." Somewhere behind Ajal, one of the aides made the low gravel sound that passed on this ship, for a laugh cut short. Ajal didn't laugh. He looked at her a moment longer, and then he said, in the tone of a man setting a piece down on a board and watching to see how it landed, "There is a ceremony, Ms. Holt, at the conclusion of a first contact vessel's stay. A formality, mostly, a walk, a small demonstration on the show deck before the treaty terms are finalized, so that both parties understand precisely what they are agreeing to work with. I would be very interested to see how a technician from 0.63 handles it." "Overseer," Penn started, in the careful voice of a man about to spend the next several sentences apologizing for something that hadn't happened yet. "I should note that Ms. Holt is aboard in a technical capacity only, and—" "I'll be there," Mara said over him, because she'd already done the math on what it would cost the mission if the one human on this ship who could fix things flinched from an invitation the first time it was offered, and because something in her, plain and stubborn and older than this week, did not care for the word weak being used about her homeworld by a man who hadn't yet seen what her homeworld built its people out of. Ajal's brow ridge lowered a fraction, the ventral version, she'd learn, of raised eyebrows. You accept without consulting your envoy. He'll catch up, Mara said, and picked her wrench back up off the deck plate and went back to work, and didn't look up again until the sound of Ajal's footsteps, and the two aides, and finally Penn's, softer, more anxious, trailing a half-beat behind, had faded back out of the bay. Vren, crouched beside her again once the officers were gone, let out a long breath through his nose that the translator didn't bother rendering, because it didn't need to. You should not have agreed to that so quickly. Why not? Because no one ever has, Vren said. Not once in 11 cycles. They always ask for a day to consider it. Ajal takes the asking as the answer. It's part of the ceremony too, in its way. The hesitation is the first collapse. You didn't hesitate. Mara thought about the coupling and the wrench, and Ajal's flat, careful voice saying weak number like it settled something. Yeah, well, she said. Nobody asked me before they sent me up a scaffold in February either. You get used to saying yes before you've thought about it too hard. Vren didn't have anything to say to that. He watched her work for a while longer, in the particular quiet of someone recalculating something, and then he went back to his own end of the bay, and the coupling hummed on, steady now, the stutter gone out of it entirely. The show deck sat 2 levels above the repair bay, and Mara didn't see it until the 3rd day, when a message came down from the bridge, not from Ajal directly, but from an aide with a title the translator rendered, unhelpfully, as second voice, informing her that the coupling repair had bought Earth's delegation 2 additional days aboard the Ashvin, and that the overseer had decided to use them. Use them how? Mara asked. There will be a series of demonstrations, the second voice said, leading to the ceremony. It is customary. Customary for who? For every species that has stood where you are standing, the aide said, and left it at that, and left her standing in the corridor with Penn, who had the look of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. I want to be clear about something, Penn said, once the aide was gone. This isn't in any briefing I was given. Nobody at State told me there'd be a physical component to this. I was told there'd be trade terms, resource access, a few ceremonial toasts. Nobody said anything about, he gestured vaguely at the corridor's ceiling toward the deck above, whatever this is going to be. It's a dominance ritual, Mara said. Vren told me. They do it to every species they meet. See how long the new guys stay standing before anybody sits down at a table. Penn looked at her for a long moment, and you agreed to participate in it, on the first day. Without asking me. You'd have said no. I'd have said let's find out what it costs us first, Penn said, not unkindly, in the tone of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where the wrong yes cost a country something it couldn't get back. That's the job, Ms. Holt. I don't get paid to be brave. I get paid to be slow. Mara didn't have an answer for that one that she liked, so she didn't give him one. She just said, I'm not backing out now, and Penn sighed, the particular sigh of a man who'd known that was coming before he asked and told her he'd be there. The show deck turned out to be a long, open hall with a domed ceiling of some pale material that let starlight bleed through it in soft, moving patterns, ringed on 3 sides by a raised gallery where, by the time Mara arrived the next morning, perhaps 30 Vantral officers had already gathered, more than she'd seen in one place the whole trip, in dress plating polished to a dull sheen, murmuring to each other in a low collective rumble that cut off almost entirely the moment she stepped through the archway. Ajal stood at the center of the floor, and beside him, on a low pedestal, sat a single unadorned block of gray alloy roughly the size of a footlocker. Ms. Holt, he said, you'll forgive the audience. Word travels quickly on a ship this size, and I am afraid a great many of my officers wished to see the human who accepted the ceremony without hesitation. I don't mind an audience, Mara said, which was mostly true. She'd hung steel with 100 men watching from the ground, waiting, half of them, for her to slip. She knew how to work with eyes on her. Good, Ajal said. We'll begin simply. He gestured to the block. This is dressed at 400 kilograms. On Corvath, a mid-grade laborer moves stock of this weight without assistance for the length of a working shift. I do not expect you to match that pace. I am curious only whether you can move it at all. 400 kilos was a number Mara had a relationship with. Not lifted clean off a deck. No, nobody lifted 400 kilos clean, Vantral included. She'd learn later that even they used leverage for a dead lift that size. But she had rigged loads heavier than that 100 times over, had walked steel with loads swinging past her at that weight on a cable. She trusted more than most people. Had learned in her first year on a crew that moving heavy things wasn't about muscle so much as it was about angle, about balance. About refusing to fight the load head-on when you could walk it instead. She didn't try to lift it. She crouched, got her shoulder low against one corner, planted her boots wide the way she'd plant them under a beam, and walked it inch by inch, rocking it up onto one edge and pivoting, the way you'd walk a refrigerator across a kitchen if you didn't have a dolly, letting the block's own weight do half the work of tipping itself forward while she kept it from ever fully falling. It took her 4 minutes to walk it the length of the deck. In the gallery, the low collective rumble had gone very quiet, and Mara, sweat running down between her shoulder blades under her jacket, heard, over the ringing effort in her own ears, someone up in the gallery say something short and sharp, the tone unmistakably surprised, and someone else answer with a longer string of syllables that ended, unmistakably, in a laugh, though a thinner one than the laughs she'd been hearing in the repair bay all week. Ajal watched the whole 4 minutes without moving. When she finally straightened up, hands raw, breath coming hard, he said only, "You did not lift it." "Didn't need to." On Corvath, we would call that cheating. On Earth, Mara said, we call it not tearing your shoulder out of the socket for no reason. That got the biggest laugh of the morning, not a mocking one, or not only a mocking one. Ajal's brow ridge did the thing it had done in the repair bay. The flicker that meant something in him had recalibrated by half a degree, and he said, "Interesting," in the tone of a man filing something away, and moved on to the next demonstration before she'd fully caught her breath, which she understood by the 3rd day was simply how he operated. Never let anyone finish resting before the next test began. The next test was worse, and it was worse specifically because it wasn't a test of strength at all. It was a test of gravity. "The deck beneath you," Ajal said, "is presently held at your homeworld standard out of courtesy. I would like to raise it incrementally and observe your tolerance. Nothing more. No lifting required. Simply stand." Mara had done the reading pen insisted on during the shuttle flight up. The thin packet of everything Earth scientists had managed to piece together about vantral physiology from 6 months of scans and guesswork. And she knew, in the abstract, cold fact way you know a thing you've never felt, that going from Earth standard to Corvath standard meant your own body weight nearly doubling in the space of a few minutes. Every joint and vertebra suddenly carrying 2.5 times the load it had evolved to carry. She had not, until the gravity began to climb, understood what that meant in her knees. It came on slow. She'd give the Vantral engineers that, whatever else she thought of the ceremony, it wasn't cruel in its execution, just relentless, a smooth curve rather than a cliff. But by the time the deck reader Vren had rigged for her, off to one side, ticked past 1.5 times Earth standard, she felt it in the arches of her feet first, a deep, dull ache like she'd spent all day on concrete, and by 1.8 it had moved up into her hips. And by 2 full standards her lower back had begun sending up the kind of warning signal she associated with the last hour of a bad shift, the kind where you started making mistakes if you didn't stop. She didn't stop. She widened her stance, dropped her weight lower into her hips the way she would on a swaying platform, and breathed through it, counting 1, 2, 3. The way she'd learned to count out a bad 40 stories up when looking down was not an option, and looking up wasn't much better. In the gallery, the rumble had gone dead silent. At 2.1, her vision swam at the edges, white noise creeping in along the borders of things, and some distant, professional part of her brain, the part that had kept her alive on steel for 9 years, informed her calmly that she had perhaps another 30 seconds before her body made a decision on its own that her mind wasn't going to like. She held. She thought about the block, and the way she'd walked it instead of lifting it, and understood, in a flash that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with a decade of not falling off things, that standing still under a crushing weight was a different problem than moving under one, and that she'd been solving the wrong problem for the last 10 seconds. She stopped fighting to stand straight. She let her knees bend, let her weight settle down through her heels the way it wanted to, stopped bracing against the gravity and started, instead, simply carrying it, the way she'd carry a hod of brick up a ladder, not resisting the weight, just moving with it, redistributing it through her whole frame instead of trying to hold it all in her spine. The white noise receded. Not gone, her legs were shaking. A fine, involuntary tremor she couldn't have stopped if she'd wanted to, but she was still standing, breath ragged, boots planted, at 2.1 times her homeworld's gravity, on a deck built for creatures who'd been carrying that load their entire lives. Enough, Ajal said, and the gravity began slowly to fall back toward Earth standard, and it was only once it had dropped below 1.3 that Mara let herself sit, hard, right there on the deck plating, arms wrapped around her knees, shaking. Nobody in the gallery said anything for a long moment. Then, from somewhere up in the ring of officers, a single voice, Mara never learned whose, said something short, in a tone she didn't need the translator for, because some tones cross species without help. It was the tone of a man who had come to watch something collapse and had, instead, watched it hold. Ajal crossed the deck to where she sat and looked down at her for a long moment, his flat, wide face giving away nothing at all. 2.1, he said. You held 2.1. Felt like it, Mara said through her teeth. No delegation has held past 1.9, Ajal said. Not one, in 11 cycles. He said it the way a man might report an instrument reading he didn't fully trust, checking it against something else in his head. You should not have been able to do that. Your world does not produce that. My world produces steelworkers, Mara said, and got, unsteadily, to her feet, waving off Vren, who'd crossed the deck at a near run with a hand half extended to help her up, and pulled it back the instant she moved on her own. It's not the gravity that builds you, Overseer. It's what you spend your life fighting under it. Ajal didn't answer that immediately. He looked at her for a long moment more, and then he looked up, past her at the gallery, at 30 officers who had come expecting the same show they'd seen 11 times before and had, instead, watched a woman from a soft world stand under a crushing weight and refuse, simply, to fall down, and something in the set of his jaw tightened, not quite anger, not quite anything Mara had a word for yet. We will resume tomorrow, he said, and turned, and walked off the deck without another word, and the officers in the gallery filed out after him in a silence that had a different weight to it than the murmuring they'd walked in with. Vren caught up to Mara at the archway, matching her unsteady pace without comment on it. You understand, he said quietly, once they were clear of the last of the departing officers, that you have made this worse. How's that? Because now it isn't a formality anymore, Vren said. Now it's a question he doesn't have an answer to, and Overseer Ajal does not like questions he doesn't have answers to. He will find a bigger test. He always does. Mara thought about that the rest of the way back to her quarters. A bare little cell of a room with a cot too short for her, and a porthole looking out on stars that didn't belong to her sky, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the thought didn't scare her nearly as much as it probably should have. She spent that night, and most of the next morning, back in the repair bay, partly because there was still work to do. Vren had flagged 2 more joints in the coupling housing that wanted checking, and she was glad of an excuse to use her hands on something that made sense to her, and partly because Arthur Penn found her there around midday, looking like a man who hadn't slept. "They've moved the ceremony up," he said without preamble. 2 days from now. Full council in attendance, not just Ajal's officers. Representatives from 3 other delegations currently docked at Korvath's relay station, here to observe the terms of Earth's treaty before they finalize their own. This isn't a formality being run through the motions anymore, Mara. This is a demonstration. For an audience a great deal bigger than the one you had yesterday. "Okay," Mara said, and kept turning her wrench. "That's it, okay. What do you want me to say, Arthur?" She glanced up at him, and something in her face must have shown him more than she meant it to, because he pulled a crate over and sat down across from her instead of standing over her the way he'd been doing all week. "You want me to tell you I'm not worried? I'm worried. I stood under 2.1 G yesterday, and I've got a knot in my lower back the size of a fist, and I'm going to be feeling that for a week. But you tell me what happens to the treaty if I fold now. You tell me what a room full of alien diplomats who came to watch Earth get put in its place walks away thinking, if the one human they've actually met backs out 2 days before the finish line." Penn was quiet for a while. Then he said, more gently than he'd said anything to her all week, "You know none of this is actually your job. You were sent up here to fix a coupling." "Yeah," Mara said, "I fixed it Tuesday. And everything since has been extra." "Everything's always extra, Arthur." She set the wrench down and looked at him properly. "You ever hang steel? No, course you haven't. There's a moment every job where the crane sets a beam down and it's not quite seated right, and everybody on the ground is looking up at you, and you've got about 4 seconds to decide whether you're the guy who calls it in and waits for someone to fix it properly, or the guy who reaches out over open air and walks it home himself. 99 times out of 100 you call it in. That's the smart move, and I've made it plenty. But every now and then you're the only one close enough, and it's not going to hold till someone smarter gets there, and you reach. And you think this is one of those times." "I think," Mara said, "that Ajal spent 11 cycles telling every species he's ever met that their world made them weak, and I think somebody ought to make him do the math on that in front of an audience big enough that it sticks. And I think I'm the only one close enough to the beam." Penn looked at her for a long moment, and then he laughed, a short, tired, genuine laugh, the first she'd heard out of him since the shuttle. "God help the State Department," he said, "the day it works out how many of its treaties actually got signed because some ironworker from Pittsburgh decided to reach for a beam." "Don't tell them," Mara said, "ruins the mystique." Vren, 3 benches down, had been listening without any pretense of not listening, and when Penn finally left, muttering something about needing to draft a report he had no idea how to write, the young engineer came over and crouched beside her again, quiet for a while before he spoke. "The ceremony," he said, "the long descent, I should tell you what it actually is before you walk into it not knowing. I figured you would eventually." "There's a dais," Vren said, "raised at the head of the show deck reached by a short stair. The delegate stands at the top before the full council, while the gravity is brought to Korvath standard around them, not gradually, this time all at once, the moment the treaty terms are read aloud, and then they are asked to descend the stair unassisted and cross the floor to stand before the overseer and receive the treaty in person." He paused. "Nobody has ever made it down the stair standing. That is, in fact, rather the point. The descent is meant to put you at his level, literally, physically, beneath him, before the ink goes on the treaty. It sets the terms of every conversation that follows for the rest of your species' dealings with Korvath." Mara sat with that for a moment. "And if I don't fall?" Vren looked at her, and there was something in his flat alien face that she was fairly sure by now she'd learned to read as worry. "Then I don't know what happens," he said. "It has never happened. Ajal has built 11 cycles of reputation on the certainty that it will. I don't know what the ceremony becomes if you're the one who breaks it." "Guess we'll find out," Mara said, and picked her wrench back up, because it was the only thing in the room that made sense to her right then, and went back to work. By the following morning, the Ashvin had acquired an audience it hadn't had 2 days before. 3 shuttles from the delegations docked at Korvath's relay station arrived before breakfast. Mara didn't get more than a glimpse of the delegates themselves, glimpsed through a viewport as their shuttles crossed the bay. A tall, reed-thin species with too many joints in their arms, wrapped head to foot in insulated wraps. A squat, 4-eyed pair who moved everywhere in a kind of rolling shuffle. A single towering figure, broader even than a Vantral, who never left its shuttle at all and communicated, when it communicated, through a floating relay drone. Word had gotten around the relay station, apparently faster than Mara would have credited. The human hadn't fallen yet. Everyone wanted to see whether that held. Ajal did not seem thrilled about the extra audience, which surprised her, until Vren explained it over breakfast in the crew mess. A long, low-ceilinged room where Mara had spent most of her meals so far being watched, with polite but undisguised interest, by whichever crew happened to be off shift. "Raises the stakes for him as much as for you," Vren said. "If you fail, as every delegation before you has failed, it reinforces 11 cycles of reputation in front of witnesses who matter, witnesses who will go home and tell their own governments exactly how Korvath handles first contact, and why it's wise to negotiate humbly. That's worth a great deal to him." He picked at his own meal, some grayish paste that Mara had decided, 4 days in, not to ask too many questions about. "But if you don't fail, if the human is the one who breaks it, in front of 3 delegations instead of just his own crew, then the story that goes home isn't the story he wants told. He can't call off the extra witnesses now without admitting that's exactly what he's afraid of. So he's stuck escalating." "Sounds like a bad spot to be in." "It is the spot he built for himself," Vren said without much sympathy, 11 cycles running. The escalation, when it came, took the shape of a challenge Mara hadn't been expecting, not another test of raw endurance, but something closer, this time, to actual competition. A young Vantral officer named Dresk, broad even by his species standards, decorated in the kind of ceremonial scarring Mara had learned marked a warrior caste rather than an engineering one, presented himself on the show deck before the demonstration began, and through the translator, informed her, with a confidence so total it was almost admirable, that he would personally carry the 400-kilo block the length of the deck faster than she had, and that she was welcome to attempt to match his time, if she felt her methods from the previous day held up under direct comparison. It wasn't Ajal's idea, she gathered from the murmur that ran through the gallery, a murmur with an edge of surprise in it, this time, rather than anticipation. But Ajal didn't stop it either, which told her plenty about how far he was willing to let things run now that the audience had grown. Dresk went first, and he was fast, genuinely fast, hauling the block onto one shoulder in a single fluid motion that made the crowd rumble with approval, and covering the length of the deck in just under 90 seconds, setting the block down with the kind of flourish that told Mara, more clearly than anything Vren had said, exactly how confident this ship's officers had become that the last 2 days were an aberration about to be corrected. She didn't try to beat his time. She'd known, the moment he offered the challenge, that she couldn't, not lifting it clean the way he had, not with his frame, not with his gravity behind him his whole life. What she did instead, once he'd stepped back with the particular satisfied stillness of a man expecting to watch someone fail to follow him, was walk the block the same way she had the day before, corner, shoulder, rock, pivot, except that this time, 4 minutes into the walk, with her legs burning and the gallery gone quiet again in that particular way it went quiet when nobody was sure yet what they were watching, she didn't stop at the far wall. She turned around and walked it back. It took her 9 minutes total. Nobody had asked her to. Nobody had timed a return trip, because nobody had ever attempted one. The demonstration, as designed, ended at the wall. But she'd done the load calculation on the walk over that morning, lying awake with her back still aching from the day before, and worked out that the point of Dresk's challenge wasn't speed at all. It was a comparison rigged to make speed the only thing that mattered, because speed was the one category a Vantral would always win. So she'd changed the category. Not who could move it fastest, who could move it longest. By the time she set the block back down where it had started, hands shaking, breath tearing, Dresk was no longer smiling. "That was not the challenge," he said, through the translator, and there was something almost plaintive in it. A young man watching the ground shift under a contest he'd been sure of an hour ago. "You said match your methods," Mara said. "I matched my methods. Nobody said stop at the wall." In the gallery, someone laughed, the reedy, many-jointed delegate, Mara thought, though she couldn't be certain, and it wasn't a cruel laugh, or not only a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of an outside observer watching a house's rules get quietly rewritten by a guest who'd read the fine print more carefully than the host had. Ajil, watching from the floor's edge, said nothing at all for a long moment. Then he said, to Dresk, in a tone that needed no translation to land like a rebuke, "You proposed a contest without first defining its boundaries. That is a failure of preparation, not of strength." And Dresk withdrew from the deck with his ceremonial scars burning a darker shade than they'd started, and Mara understood, watching him go, that she had just made an enemy who mattered a good deal less than the ally she'd apparently made in Ajil's exasperation, because the overseer's eyes, when they came back to her, held something that hadn't been there the day before. Not warmth. Calculation sharpened. "You continue to solve the wrong problem correctly," he said. "I solved the problem that's actually in front of me," Mara said. "Your officer wanted a race. I gave him an endurance test instead. That's not cheating, overseer. That's just paying attention." "On Korvath," Ajil said, "we call that a soldier's instinct. I did not expect to find it on a world at .63. "You keep saying that number like it explains something," Mara said, and this time she let a little of the last 2 days show in her voice, tired and raw at the edges. "It doesn't. You've got a world with a rock spinning hard enough under it to make everybody strong just for standing up in the morning. Fine. Good for you. My world doesn't hand it to anybody. Everything I've got, I built, with a hammer and a harness, and about 9 years of mornings where the alternative to getting strong enough was falling 40 stories. That's not weak gravity making weak people. That's a world that makes you earn every bit of what you're carrying, instead of a planet handing it to you for free." The gallery had gone very quiet again. Ajil studied her for a long moment, his flat, wide face unreadable in the way it always was, and then he said, quietly enough that she wasn't sure it was meant for the whole deck to hear, "Earn every bit of what you're carrying." A pause. "That is not a phrase my engineers would use. Our gravity does the carrying, Miss Holt. It has, for longer than either of us has been alive. We do not lift 400 kilos for sport because our arms are strong. We lift it because the ground beneath us has told our bodies, for 10,000 generations, that this is simply what a body does." Something flickered across his face, not doubt, not yet, but the first shadow of a question he hadn't thought to ask before this week. "I confess I had not considered what a body does when the ground makes no such promise, and the body must decide, entirely on its own, to become strong anyway." "Now you're getting it," Mara said. "I am getting a question," Ajil said, "not an answer. The long descent will provide the answer." He turned, the moment closing over as cleanly as it had opened, and raised his voice for the gallery. "Tomorrow, full council. The ceremony proceeds as scheduled." That night Mara couldn't sleep, and she wasn't alone in that. She found Vren in the repair bay past the hour his shift should have ended, running a diagnostic on a panel that, as far as she could tell, didn't need one. the particular busywork of a man who needed his hands occupied so his head would leave him alone. "You should be resting," he said without looking up when she sat down across from him. "So should you." He didn't answer that. She let the silence sit a while watching him work, and then she said, "Tell me about the dais, the actual floor of it, what it's made of." Vren's hand stilled just slightly on the panel. "Why?" "Because you're the only person on this ship who's told me anything true without being asked twice, and I figure if there's something worth knowing before I walk down that stair tomorrow, you're the one who'd know it." He was quiet for a long moment, turning a small tool over in his hands the way she turned a wrench when she was thinking. "It's a processional alloy," he said, finally. "Light decorative. Every dais on every ceremonial deck in the fleet is cast from the same batch specification, has been for longer than I've served. It's rated for foot traffic. Officers cross it during rites in soft-soled ceremonial wear. Gravity assists doing most of the actual work of keeping their steps light. Nobody's ever asked it to take a hard footfall at full load. There's never been a reason to." "Why not?" "Because we don't walk that way," Vren said, and something in his voice when he said it made Mara go very still and listen harder. "Not on ceremony decks, not in dress plating. A working vantral hauling stock in a cargo bay plants his weight the way you do hard direct, all of it landing at once because that's efficient and efficiency is what work demands. But the dais isn't a working floor. It's a floor built for men who have spent their whole careers being careful where they put their weight down, in a setting where being careful is the entire point of the exercise. Nobody in 11 cycles has ever hit that floor with a real stride. Every delegate who's ever crossed it has been too busy falling down to plant a foot properly at all." Mara sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way she'd turn a bad joint under her palm, feeling for the rhythm in it. "So nobody's ever actually tested that floor?" "Not once," Vren said. "Why would they need to?" "No reason," Mara said. "No reason at all." And she didn't say anything else about it, though she thought about it off and on, for most of the rest of the night. Not as a plan, not yet, nothing so deliberate as that. Just a fact sitting in the back of her head next to all the other facts a good technician collects without quite knowing yet which one's going to matter. She thought, too, about her first week on steel, 19 years old and half convinced she'd made the worst decision of her life. And the old foreman, Duda, everyone called him. Nobody remembered why, who'd caught her creeping across a beam on her toes like she was walking a tightrope, terrified of her own weight, and had told her, not unkindly, that the beam didn't care how careful she was. The beam only cared whether she trusted it enough to walk it like she meant it. "Careful gets you killed up here, girl," he'd said. "Certain keeps you alive." She'd thought about that phrase 1,000 times in 9 years since. She thought about it again now, lying in a bed too short for her under a sky that wasn't hers, and fell asleep somewhere past midnight without ever quite deciding she'd stopped worrying. The inspection came before breakfast, delivered by an officer Mara hadn't met yet, older, heavy-set even by vantral standards, wearing plating scored with the kind of deep, deliberate etching that Vren later told her marked a quartermaster superior. The officer responsible, among other things, for certifying that any equipment brought aboard a Corvath vessel met fleet standard before it could be logged as part of the ship's working inventory. His name, as near as the translator could render it, was Ashkath, and he arrived in the repair bay with 2 junior aides and a data slate already half filled with observations he had apparently made simply by walking the length of the bay once, unannounced, at first light. "I am told," Ashkath said, without introducing himself, setting the slate down on the bench beside Mara's open toolbox with the particular contempt of a man handling something faintly unsanitary, "that this collection has been logged as functional shipboard equipment for 5 days, under the overseer's personal authorization. I confess I found the report difficult to credit until I saw it myself." Mara straightened up from the panel she'd been receding and looked at the toolbox, her toolbox, the same scuffed steel case she'd carried up 3 flights of scaffolding 100 times back home, wrenches and drivers, and a hand-crank ratchet arranged in the same order they'd been arranged in since her first year on steel, and then back at Ashketh, and said nothing at all, because she'd learned, 5 days in, that the smartest thing to do with a man who'd already decided what he thought was let him finish deciding it out loud first. No resonance calibration, Ashketh said, lifting her ratchet between 2 thick fingers and turning it over the way Rensk had turned over her wrench on the first day, except with none of Rensk's grudging curiosity, only a kind of flat administrative disdain. No power cell, no diagnostic feed, a child's toy on Korvath. I have seen apprentice cadets, 6 cycles old, issued better calibrated instruments for their first lessons in the training yards. He set it down, precisely, a half-inch from where he'd picked it up, the gesture of a man determined not to touch it any longer than the inspection required. I am obligated to note, for the fleet record, that this vessel's most critical drive coupling, a component rated for catastrophic failure classification, should it fail in transit, was repaired using implements that would not pass a fleet certification board for a cadet's toolkit. I intend to include that observation in my report to the Quartermaster General. Include whatever you want, Mara said. The coupling's holding. You can check the readings yourself. I have checked the readings, Ashketh said. That is precisely what troubles me. The readings are nominal, which means either your instruments are, against every principle of Korvath engineering doctrine, somehow adequate to the task, or the fault was never as severe as our own sensor suite reported, and a great deal of alarm was raised over nothing, by a diagnostic system that ought to have known better than to be fooled by a soft-world technician with a metal stick. He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd entered the bay, and something in his broad, scored face made clear which of those 2 explanations he found less objectionable. I would prefer the second explanation, Ms. Holt. It would trouble me a great deal less than the alternative. The alternative being that I actually fixed it, Mara said. The alternative, Ashketh said, being that fleet doctrine has been wrong about what a soft world can produce for longer than I have served, and that is not a small thing for a quartermaster superior to be asked to accept over a bench full of children's tools before he has even had his first meal of the day. Vren, who had come in partway through the exchange and gone very still by the bay's far wall, chose that moment to speak up, and Mara heard, in the careful evenness of his voice, a young officer doing everything he could not to overstep in front of a much senior one. Quartermaster Superior, if I may. I have run the coupling's harmonic profile against baseline 3 times since the repair. The fault Ms. Holt identified was real. Our own sensor suite flagged it as nominal for 2 full days before she found it by hand. I have the logs, if you wish to review them. Ashketh looked at Vren for a long moment, the particular weighing look of a senior officer deciding whether a junior's intervention was insubordination or simply useful information, and apparently settled on the latter, because he gestured, curtly, for the logs, and spent the next several minutes reviewing them in a silence that had, Mara noted, considerably less contempt in it than the silence he'd walked in with. This is not calibrated instrumentation, he said, finally, setting the slate down again, more slowly this time. This is a woman's bare hand against a housing wall. That's right, Mara said. And it outperformed 6 shipboard sensor arrays. Looks that way. Ashketh was quiet for a long moment, turning her ratchet over one more time, this time without the contempt, more the careful, assessing handling of a man revising an opinion in real time, and finding the process considerably less comfortable than he'd expected it to be. I have logged 400 vessels in my career, Ms. Holt, he said, finally. I have certified equipment from 11 species, none of it resembling this in the slightest, and all of it, without exception, more sophisticated than a metal stick in a woman's hand. I do not know what to write in my report. Write that it worked, Mara said. That's usually the only part of a report that actually matters, in my experience. Ashketh didn't answer that directly. He collected his aids and his data slate, and left the bay considerably more slowly than he'd entered it, pausing once at the archway to look back not at Mara, but at the toolbox itself, sitting open on the bench in the same scuffed, unglamorous order it had sat in every day since she'd carried it up the shuttle ramp, with an expression that Mara, watching him go, decided was the particular look of a man whose whole professional certainty had just taken a small, quiet, permanent dent. The kind that wouldn't show on the outside for weeks yet, but that he'd be feeling, she suspected, every time he certified a piece of equipment for the rest of his career. He'll write something diplomatic, Vren said, once the officer's footsteps had faded down the corridor. Ashketh always does, but he won't forget this. None of them will, I think. He looked at Mara's toolbox for a long moment, the same scuffed case that had been mocked, poked at, and dismissed by nearly every Vantral who'd set foot in this bay over the last 5 days, and something in his face, when he spoke again, carried the particular weight of a man watching an old certainty finish coming apart in front of him one small piece at a time. I keep thinking there is a lesson in it, somewhere. That the most sophisticated instruments on this ship spent 2 days being wrong about something a woman's bare hand, and a length of unpowered steel got right in 20 minutes. I am not certain yet what the lesson is, only that I don't think I will look at a fully calibrated system the same way again. The lesson's simple enough, Mara said, closing the toolbox and latching it, the same familiar click it had made 1,000 times before, on 100 different job sites, on a world 2.5 times softer than the one she was standing on now. Sometimes the fanciest tool in the room isn't the right one for the job in front of you. Took me about 9 years to learn that. Glad your quartermaster's getting the express version. Vren laughed at that, the low gravel sound she'd come to genuinely like, and the morning's work went on from there, steadier for the interruption rather than slower, and it was somewhere in the middle of that ordinary, unremarkable stretch of bolt checking and panel reseating that Mara realized, distantly, that the bay had gone quiet in a different way than it had been quiet on her first day. Not the quiet of people waiting for her to fail, but the plain, comfortable quiet of people simply working alongside someone they'd stopped needing to have an opinion about. The reed-thin delegate found her in the mess hall later that morning, before the sun pattern in the ceiling had even fully brightened to what passed, on the ashvane, for daylight. It moved the way its whole species seemed to move, in a loose, unhurried unfolding of too many joints, and folded itself down onto the bench across from her with a series of small clicks that Mara had started to associate, after 2 days of overhearing them across the mess, with something like laughter held politely in check. "You are the one who walked the block twice," it said, through its own translator, a small woven device worn at the base of its throat rather than pinned to a collar. Its voice, rendered, came out reedy and precise, each word set down like a stone placed carefully in a row. "That's me. We have watched 11 of these ceremonies," the delegate said. "My people, not aboard this vessel at the relay station by report and twice in person on other Korvath ships in other systems, always the same shape. A new species arrives, the overseer's people demonstrate strength, the visitors demonstrate the absence of it, terms are set accordingly." It tilted its narrow head, an unmistakably curious gesture even across the gap between their species. "You have demonstrated something else. I confess we do not yet have a category for it." "What would you call it?" "On my world," the delegate said, after a moment's consideration, "we have a word for water that finds its way around a stone rather than breaking against it, and arrives at the bottom of the hill regardless. It is not the word for strength. It is a different word. I think it may be closer to what you are doing than anything Korvath has a word for." Mara turned that over for a moment, chewing on breakfast that still hadn't gotten any more identifiable 4 days in. "I like that better than weak world," she said. "I imagine you would," the delegate said, and made the small clicking sound again, and this time Mara was fairly sure it really was laughter. May I offer you a thing I have observed, human, since you are new to this and I am not? The overseer has built a great deal of his standing on the certainty of that stare. 11 cycles of it. Men who build their standing on a single certainty do not react well when the certainty breaks. Some become smaller. Some become larger if the ground under them lets them. I do not know Ajal well enough to say which he will be, but I would watch him closely tomorrow after the floor tells him what it tells him, because whatever he does in that first moment will likely be the truest thing you ever see him do. It rose, unfolding itself back upright in that same loose, patient way, and inclined its narrow head to her, a gesture she hadn't seen it use with anyone else on the ship, and left her sitting there with a breakfast going cold, and a thought she carried with her for the rest of the day. Ajal came to find her that afternoon, which surprised her more than the reed-thin delegate's visit had, because he came alone, no aides, no second voice trailing him with a data slate, just the overseer himself, ducking under the low archway into the repair bay in his plain working plating rather than the polished dress version she'd only ever seen him wear before this. "I want to show you something," he said, and led her, without much further explanation, down a level and aft, to a section of the ship she hadn't seen, narrower corridors, older plating, the particular scuffed and lived-in look of a part of a vessel that visitors weren't generally shown. He stopped, finally, before a bulkhead viewport looking out over what she realized, after a moment, was Corveth itself, hanging vast and close in the black, banded in storm systems the size of continents, its curve filling most of the port. "I was 19 cycles old," Ajal said, without preamble, looking out at the planet rather than at her. "The first time I stood on a show deck like the one you'll stand on tomorrow. Not as the overseer administering the ceremony, as the delegate receiving it. My clan had been conquered by a rival house 11 years prior, a stronger house, from a stronger holding, higher up the northern ranges where the gravity runs even harder than the world average. They brought me before their assembly as a hostage ward and made me stand under their gravity while their elders watched to see whether my clan's blood was worth sparing or worth ending." He was quiet for a moment. "I did not fall. I have never told anyone aboard this ship why I built the long descent the way I did. It was not Corvath tradition before me. I built it, cycle by cycle, out of the one morning of my own life I have never stopped standing on." Mara didn't say anything for a moment, turning that over, the picture of a 19-year-old Ajal, terrified, refusing to fall in front of the people who'd taken his home, and the picture of the overseer she'd spent 4 days sparring with, 30 officers deep in ceremony and reputation, and finding, to her own mild surprise, that the two pictures fit together more easily than she'd expected. "So every delegation you've put through that ceremony," she said slowly, "you've been asking them to do the one thing you did." "I have been testing whether they could," Ajal said. "And when they could not, when every one of them fell, cycle after cycle, I confess I came, somewhere along the way, to believe that meant something true about the universe, that the ground a species is born on writes the whole of what they can become, that I had simply been born on harder ground than most, and had therefore become harder, and that this was fair, in the plain way gravity is fair, indifferent, unchosen, and absolute." He turned, finally, to look at her. "You have spent 4 days making a very old man wonder whether he built a religion out of a single morning that might not have meant what he thought it meant." "I'm not trying to take anything away from you," Mara said quietly. "What you did at 19, that's real. Nobody's handing you that story for free. I'm just telling you it's not the gravity that did it, it's you. It was always you. The gravity just gave you something to prove it against." Ajal looked at her for a long time, out there in the narrow, scuffed corridor with Corveth turning slow and vast in the port behind him, and said nothing at all for long enough that Mara began to wonder if she'd overstepped in a way that couldn't be walked back. Then he said quietly, "Tomorrow, the gravity will be set to full Corveth standard at your world's .63 baseline. the instant the treaty terms are read. There will be no incremental rise this time, no courtesy curve. It will be the same weight I stood under at 19, delivered all at once, the way it was delivered to me. A pause. I built the ceremony that way on purpose, Ms. Holt. I am telling you now because some part of me, a part I did not fully understand until this conversation, apparently did not want you walking into it blind. Why tell me that? Because I find, Ajal said, that I no longer entirely know what outcome I am hoping for. And he turned and left her alone in the corridor with Corvath's slow, banded curve filling the port, and did not say anything further. She found Penn afterward and told him what Ajal had said, all of it, the story about the 19-year-old and the conquered clan and the ceremony built out of a single unforgotten morning, and Penn sat with it for a long time before he spoke. "That's not a villain," he said finally. "That's a man who's been carrying something for a very long time and built an entire diplomatic doctrine to keep from having to look at it directly. Doesn't make the doctrine less of a problem." "No," Penn agreed. "It doesn't, but it changes what tomorrow is a little. You're not walking down a stair to spite a bully, Mara. You're walking down a stair in front of a man who's spent his whole career testing the rest of the galaxy against the worst morning of his life, because it's easier than admitting the morning might have been about him, and not about the ground under his feet." He looked at her steady, the diplomat's caution mostly gone out of his face for once. "I don't know what that does to your nerve. I imagine it doesn't help." "It doesn't hurt either," Mara said after a moment. "I've worked with plenty of foremen who ran a crew scared because somebody scared them first, 20 years back, and never got over it. Doesn't change what I do with a wrench in my hand. Doesn't change what I do on a stair either." She flexed her hands, still faintly raw from the block, and looked out the narrow porthole at the black. "I just do the job in front of me, Arthur. Tomorrow the job's standing up." Penn nodded slowly and didn't say anything more, and left her to whatever was left of the evening, and Mara spent the last hour of it exactly the way she'd spent the last hour of every hard day for 9 years running, sitting quietly by herself, going over the work in her head one more time, and not, for even a minute, letting herself wonder what it would feel like to fail. The betting had started somewhere on the second day and reached, by the night before the ceremony, a scale that Vren found faintly embarrassing to explain, and Mara found, once she understood the mechanics of it, genuinely funny in a way she hadn't let herself be all week. "It's not official," Vren said, half apologetic, finding her in the corridor outside her quarters with the particular sideways posture of a man delivering information he wasn't sure he should be delivering. "Officers aren't permitted to wager on ceremony outcomes. That rule has existed for 11 cycles, and in 11 cycles, as far as I am aware, no one has ever once obeyed it." "What are the odds?" Mara asked, mostly out of curiosity, and mostly because she suspected the answer would tell her something true about how the ship actually felt, underneath all the careful diplomatic language about what tomorrow held. 6 cycles ago, before you arrived, the standing wager on any long descent was simple: how many steps the delegate manages before falling. Nobody has ever taken more than 4. Vren hesitated. "The wagering on you has shifted. Nobody is betting on how many steps anymore. They're betting on whether you reach the dais floor at all, and if you do, what happens to it when you do." "What happens to it?" Mara repeated. "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning," Vren said, with the particular careful precision of a man choosing his words to avoid sounding as though he believed something absurd, "that Rensk has apparently wagered a month's ration credits that the floor cracks. Ashketh, I am told, wagered against him, not because he believes you will fall, he made a point of specifying, but because he does not believe you capable of anything so dramatic as breaking Corvath alloy with a footstep, dramatic gestures not being, in his professional experience, a trait he associates with technicians who fix things quietly and go home." Mara laughed, the first real laugh she'd had in 2 days, low and startled. "Tell Ashkith I appreciate the vote of confidence either way." "I don't think he intended it as one," Vren said, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely sure either. "For what it's worth, I have not wagered. I don't believe I know enough yet to guess correctly, and I find I would rather simply watch and learn than pretend I already know the shape of what's coming." "Smart," Mara said. "That's about the only honest position anybody on this ship's taken all week." They stood together in the corridor a while longer, neither of them in any particular hurry to end the conversation, the ship's low ambient hum settling around them the way it always did in the hours when most of the crew had gone to whatever passed, on the Ashving, for sleep. "Can I tell you something?" Vren said eventually, "that I would not say in front of Ajal or Rensk or anyone else aboard?" "Go ahead." "I hope the floor breaks," he said quietly. "Not because I dislike the overseer or wish him embarrassed in front of 100 witnesses and 4 foreign delegations. I respect him a great deal, genuinely. But I have spent 11 cycles watching this ceremony run the same course, delegation after delegation, and I have never once, until you arrived, believed there was another course available to run. I would like to see it, even once, even at his expense. I think some part of him would like to see it too, whether or not he has admitted that to himself yet." Mara considered that, and thought about the corridor conversation 2 nights from now that hadn't happened yet, but that she couldn't have known was coming. Ajal, alone, looking out at Korvath, telling her about a 19-year-old hostage ward who'd refused to fall and found, without being able to explain exactly why, that she believed Vren was right. "We'll find out tomorrow," she said. "We will," Vren agreed, and inclined his head to her, the small formal gesture she'd come to recognize by now as his version of good night, and left her alone in the corridor with the ship's hum and a night's worth of thinking still ahead of her before the morning finally came. The show deck on the morning of the ceremony had been transformed in a way that made Mara understand, for the first time, just how much theater the Vantral built into a moment they'd already decided the outcome of 11 times running. The gallery that had held 30 officers 2 days before now held better than 100, ringed 3 deep, along every rail, dress plating catching the pale starlight bleeding down through the dome overhead. The 4 visiting delegations had been given a raised platform of their own, off to one side, the reed-thin envoy near the front, its many joints folded with what Mara had come to recognize as attentive stillness. The 4-eyed pair beside it, all 4 eyes trained, unblinking, on the dais at the deck's far end. The towering delegate's floating relay drone hovering at the platform's edge, its single dark lens fixed and patient. The dais itself sat raised at the head of the hall, reached by a short flight of shallow stone-toned steps, its floor a wide circle of pale, faintly lustrous alloy tile that Mara had walked past twice this week without really looking at, and looked at now with the particular focused attention she gave any surface she was about to be asked to trust her weight to. It looked from 30 feet away exactly like what Vren had described, light, decorative, cast for men in soft-soled ceremonial, where who crossed it with their weight half carried by grav assists built into their own boots. It did not look like a floor with anything to prove. Ajal stood at its center, in full dress plating polished to a mirror sheen, flanked by his second voice and 2 officers Mara hadn't met, holding between them a data slate inscribed with the treaty terms she'd been given a copy of 2 nights before and had read through twice, mostly trade language and resource access clauses, and the kind of diplomatic boilerplate that made her eyes glaze over on a good day, except for the final clause. The one pen had flagged for her, with a grim little note in the margin. Terms subject to ratification contingent upon the satisfactory conclusion of the long descent, as customary, which meant, in plain language, that everything else in the document, every trade route, every resource concession, every word of it hinged on what happened on this floor in the next 10 minutes. Arthur Penn stood at the base of the stair, in a suit that had clearly been pressed sometime in the last hour by someone determined that Earth's delegation would look, at minimum, unbothered, even if unbothered was doing a great deal of work in his expression right now. He caught Mara's eye as she crossed the deck toward him and gave her a small, tight nod that carried more in it than any speech could have. "You don't have to do this," he said, quietly, one last time, because she understood by now it was his job to say it even though they both knew what the answer would be. "I know," Mara said. "Whatever happens up there," Penn said, "Earth still got a functioning coupling fixed by a woman who walked onto an alien warship and didn't blink. That's not nothing. That's true no matter what that floor does." "I know that too," Mara said, and squeezed his shoulder once briefly, and climbed the shallow steps to stand at the top of the dais, beside Ajal, before the full weight of 100 alien officers and 4 watching delegations, and looked out over a gallery that had gone, all at once, entirely silent. Ajal raised the data slate, and his voice, when it came, carried out across the deck in the flat. Deep register the translator gave every ventral, pitched now to reach the full gallery rather than just the small knot of people who'd watched the last 2 days unfold in the repair bay. "Terms of first contact between the sovereign holdings of Korvath and the delegation of the world designated Earth," he read, and the words rolled on from there, trade language, resource clauses, the boilerplate Mara had already half memorized, while she stood at his shoulder and felt beneath her boots the deck's low hum shift subtly in pitch. Vren had told her what that meant. The grav generators spooling up. "Terms subject to ratification," Ajal read, reaching the final clause, and here, for just a moment, his flat translated voice did something Mara hadn't heard it do before, hesitated, fractionally. The pause of a man reading words he had written himself, cycles ago, and hearing them, for the first time, as something other than settled fact, contingent upon the satisfactory conclusion of the long descent, as customary. He lowered the slate. The hum beneath Mara's boots deepened, sharpened, and she felt the weight begin to come down on her all at once. Not the slow, courteous curve of 2 days before, but a single continuous drop, her body's own mass climbing toward 2.5 times what it had ever known in the space of perhaps 4 seconds. Every joint from her ankles to her jaw suddenly reporting a weight it had never been asked to carry, not gradually earned, but simply, instantly, imposed. She staggered once, an involuntary half-step, her body's first honest reaction to a weight that had arrived faster than thought, and heard, from the gallery, a low collective intake of breath, 100 officers leaning forward as one, because a stagger on this deck on this morning was the sound 11 cycles of witnesses had been trained to listen for as the opening note of a collapse. She did not collapse. She planted her boots wider, dropped her weight down into her hips the way she had 2 days before, and breathed 1, 2, 3, and found, somewhere in the space of those 3 counted breaths, the same trick her body had found on the show deck the first time. Stop fighting the weight, start carrying it. Let it run down through her whole frame instead of trying to hold it all in her spine. Beside her, Ajal had gone very still, watching her with an intensity that had nothing left in it of ceremony and everything in it of a man watching a question he'd asked 11 times finally, possibly, about to be answered differently. "You may begin the descent whenever you are ready, Ms. Holt," he said quietly, and Mara understood in the particular flatness of his translated voice that he meant it exactly as plainly as he'd said it. No theater left in it at all. Just a man who had run out of certainty and was waiting, along with everyone else in the gallery, to find out what came next. Mara looked down the short flight of stone-toned steps to the wide circle of pale alloy tile at their base, and thought, for one strange, suspended second of the beam 40 stories over Pittsburgh, and the 4 seconds a man gets to decide whether he's the one who reaches, an old Duda's voice, gravel rough, telling a terrified 19-year-old girl that the beam doesn't care how careful you are, that careful gets you killed up here and certain keeps you alive, and she stepped forward off the top step, down onto the stair. The first step took everything she had. 2.5 times her own weight bore down through her right leg as she lowered it onto the second stair, and for one long, sick half-second her knee threatened to buckle under a load it had never once in 29 years been asked to carry all at once. And then it held, the tendon and cartilage and stubborn, work-built muscle around it doing exactly what 9 years of steel had built them to do. And she was standing on the second step, breathing hard, boots planted, upright. The gallery had gone so silent she could hear, faintly, the hum of the grav generators under the deck, and beneath that, fainter still, the small mechanical clicks of the reed-thin delegate's translator device as it murmured something to itself that nobody was listening to. She took the third step, the fourth. Each one cost her more than the last, not because the weight was increasing. It had already reached its full, terrible plateau, but because her legs, her back, the small stabilizing muscles along her spine that had never in her life been asked to fire this hard for this long, were beginning, individually, to fail. One small failure compounding into the next the way a bad rivet failure runs down a whole seam if you let it. She did not let it. She widened her stance another fraction on the fifth step, dropped her center of gravity another inch, and thought about nothing at all except the next foot, the next 4 seconds, the next honest decision about where to put her weight down. She reached the base of the stair, and stood for a moment on the flat gray floor of the show deck itself. Not the dais, not yet, just the approach, still solid old deck plating rated for exactly this kind of load 100 times over, and allowed herself one breath, one full ragged breath, before she looked up and across the wide circle of pale processional alloy that lay between her and Ajal, waiting at its center exactly where the ceremony required him to wait. Watching her with an expression that had stopped being unreadable sometime in the last 30 seconds and become, instead, something that looked unmistakably like hope he didn't want to admit to having. She crossed the last stretch of ordinary deck at a pace that was not fast and not slow, just even, just certain, the pace of a woman walking a beam she'd already decided to trust, and stepped, with her full and honest weight, off the working deck and onto the ceremonial tile. She would think about that footfall afterward for a long time, turn it over the way she'd turned over the phrase weak world on her first day in the repair bay, trying to work out exactly what had happened in the quarter-second between her boot leaving the old deck plating and landing on the new. She hadn't planted it carefully. She hadn't thought about the tile at all, hadn't remembered, in that moment, anything Vren had told her 2 nights ago about processional alloy and soft-soled ceremonial wear, and a floor that had never once in 11 cycles been asked to take a hard, working stride. She had simply walked the way she always walked, the way 9 years of steel had built into her before she'd ever learned to think about it, weight coming down hard and direct and all at once through the heel, and rolling forward through the whole boot, the particular honest, unhesitating footfall of someone who had spent a decade proving to a beam, 40 stories up, that she trusted it enough to walk it like she meant it. The sound the tile made was not loud at first. It was a single sharp report, almost delicate, like a sheet of river ice giving way underfoot in the first cold snap of winter. And then, in the half-second after, a spreading web of finer cracks raced outward from beneath her boot in every direction across the pale alloy, fast as frost climbing a windowpane, and the whole wide circle of processional tile that had held, untested, through 11 cycles of careful, gravity-assisted, soft-soled steps, folded inward around the point of her weight, and came apart. She dropped not far, 6 inches, maybe 8, the tile giving way beneath her rather than the floor beneath that, some structural layer under the ceremonial alloy catching her before she went any further, and stood there, one boot through the shattered floor to the ankle, at the center of a spreading fracture pattern that had reached, in under 2 seconds, nearly to the edges of the whole dais, staring down at what she'd done with an expression that, she'd learned later from 3 separate accounts, looked far less like triumph than it did like simple, honest surprise. For one long moment, nobody in the gallery made a sound at all. Then it broke not into laughter, not this time, but into 100 separate voices all speaking at once, a rolling wave of ventral exclamation crashing up and down the gallery rails. Officers leaning so far over the railings to see that Mara heard, distantly, someone's dress plating clatter against the rail itself, and cutting through all of it, unmistakable even in a language she didn't speak, the sound of shock, real, unrehearsed, 11 cycles unprecedented shock, passing through a room that had gathered to watch something entirely different happen. Ajal had not moved. He stood exactly where he'd been standing, 6 feet from her, on tile that had somehow, by some quirk of the fracture pattern, held firm beneath his own ceremonial boots, even as the floor around them had come apart. And Mara looked up from the hole in the deck, boot still wedged through shattered alloy, breathing hard, weight still bearing down at 2.5 standards, and found him staring at her with an expression she had genuinely never seen on his face before. In 5 days of watching it search for exactly the right degree of contempt to hold. His jaw was slack, his eyes, wide-set and low-lidded and permanently unimpressed in the particular architecture of his whole species face, had gone wider than she'd have thought that face could manage. One hand had risen, without his apparent notice, halfway toward his own chest, in a gesture that needed no translator at all to read. "You," he started and stopped, and Mara heard, in the flat mechanical register the translator gave him even now, something that hadn't been in his voice all week. Not anger, not the wounded pride of a man watching his ceremony fail. Something closer to a man watching the floor of his own certainty, literally and precisely, give way beneath a stranger's boot. "I didn't do anything," Mara said, once she'd found her breath, once the ringing in her own ears had receded enough that she trusted her voice not to shake. "I just walked." "You just walked," Ajal repeated, and the words came out of the translator flat, but something underneath them, some tremor in the original ventral his own voice had produced, that the translator's polite neutral register couldn't quite scrub clean, was not flat at all. In the gallery, the reed-thin delegate had risen to its full, unfolding height, watching the wreckage of the dais with what looked, even at that distance, like open fascination. The four-eyed pair had all 4 eyes fixed on Ajal rather than on Mara, watching, Mara understood a beat later, to see what he would do, because the delegate had told her, the morning before, that whatever Ajal did in this first moment would be the truest thing she ever saw him do, and every delegation on that platform had apparently come to watch for exactly the same thing. Vren was already moving. She caught sight of him shoving past 2 officers at the gallery rail, and half-vaulting the low barrier onto the deck floor itself, technicians' instincts overriding whatever protocol governed a ceremony this catastrophically off-script, and he reached her a moment before anyone else did, dropping to a crouch beside the shattered tile, running his hands along the fracture lines with the same careful, focused attention she'd watched him give the coupling housing 5 days earlier. "It's the substrate," he said, half to her, half to the gallery, his voice pitched to carry in the sudden hush that had followed Ajal's stunned silence outward through the crowd. "The alloys rated for distributed load gravity-assisted foot pressure, not a single concentrated impact at full weight. It was never," he looked up at her, and there was something in his face that Mara would remember for a long time afterward, not shock exactly, more like a man watching a hypothesis he'd carried quietly for 2 days finally, publicly, prove itself true. It was never built for a hard footfall. Nobody's ever hit it with one. "Why not?" came a voice from the gallery, the 4-eyed delegate, all 4 eyes still fixed on the wreckage, its translated voice carrying an edge of something that might have been the alien equivalent of barely suppressed delight. Vren looked up at Ajal rather than answering directly, and something passed between the young engineer and the overseer that Mara couldn't read, low caste to command rank, 5 days of careful observation compressed into a single glance. "Because we don't hit anything with a hard footfall anymore, overseer," Vren said, quietly, and Mara understood in the particular stillness that followed, that he was saying something that had needed saying on the ship for longer than 5 days. Not on ceremony decks, not in the officer corps. We haven't, in earnest, in longer than either of us has served. We let the grav assists carry the weight our boots used to carry themselves. We stopped needing to plan a hard step generations ago because the ground never once asked us to. He looked down at the shattered tile, at Mara's boot still wedged through it to the ankle, and something in his voice when he went on was almost gentle. She never had that luxury. Her whole world is built on people who still have to plant that step themselves every day because nothing built it for them first. The silence that followed that ran a long, strange beat across the gallery. 100 officers and 4 watching delegations, absorbing a sentence that had just quietly rearranged 11 cycles of settled fact into something considerably less settled. Ajal was the one who finally moved. He crossed the 6 feet of intact tile between himself and Mara, and crouched, an old man, in full dress plating, kneeling on a broken ceremonial floor in front of 100 witnesses in a way that Mara understood even before he spoke, was not a small thing for him to do, and extended one broad, plated hand toward her, not to help her up exactly, but simply, plainly offered. .63, he said quietly, in the flat translated voice that had, for 5 days, made a phrase into something like an insult, and made it now, for the first time, sound like the beginning of an apology instead. I have said that number to you as though it were the whole of your account, Ms. Holt. I believe I owe you a correction. Mara took his hand, because refusing it in front of 100 witnesses would have cost them both something neither could afford, and let him pull her up out of the shattered tile, her boot scraping free of the fracture with a small grinding sound that seemed, in the enormous quiet of the gallery, almost obscenely loud. The gravity was still at full Corvath standard. Nobody had thought yet to bring it back down. Every officer and technician on the deck too caught up in the moment to remember the mechanics running it, and she stood, swaying slightly, weight still bearing down at 2.5 times anything her body had grown up under, and did not fall. Bring the field back to Earth standard, Ajal said, over his shoulder, to nobody in particular, and somewhere off to the side, a technician scrambled for a console, and the deep hum beneath the deck began, gradually, to climb back down. Overseer, came a voice from the gallery, not the reed-thin delegate this time, but the second voice, Ajal's own aide, stepping forward to the rail with the stiff, uncertain posture of a man whose entire understanding of protocol had just come apart along with the floor. The terms. The ceremony is the long descent has not concluded as written. There is no precedent for. There is precedent now, Ajal said, without turning, still looking at Mara, at the shattered dais, at the whole ruined geometry of a ceremony he had built, cycle by cycle, out of a morning he'd carried alone for longer than he'd probably admitted even to himself. There is exactly one precedent as of this morning, and I intend to be the one who writes down what it means, rather than leaving that to 11 cycles of rumor at the relay station. He turned, finally, to face the gallery fully, drawing himself up in a way that Mara recognized, having watched him do it once before in the repair bay, as a man about to say something he'd already decided he could not take back. The long descent was built to test whether a delegate's world had made them strong enough to stand before Corvath as an equal, rather than a subject. I built it. I set its terms. And I confess to this gallery, and to the delegations who traveled here specifically to witness it, that I built it out of an assumption I have never once examined closely enough to notice I was making. That strength is a thing a world hands to its people freely, according to the weight of its own gravity, and that a soft world could therefore only ever produce soft people. He looked down at the shattered tile, at the spreading fracture lines still visible beneath the deck lighting, and something in his broad, flat face, grief, maybe, or something closer to relief, Mara genuinely couldn't tell which, moved across it and was gone. Ms. Holt's world gave her nothing, he said, .63 of true gravity and no more. and she has broken a floor that has survived 11 cycles of Corvath's own officers, in ceremonial boots, on a world that handed every one of them their strength before they'd ever earned a single measure of it themselves. He paused. I do not know, yet, what that means for how Corvath conducts first contact going forward. I know that it cannot mean what I built it to mean 5 days ago. That much this floor has settled for me, whether I wished it settled or not. The gallery had gone very quiet again, a different quiet than the shocked silence right after the crack, a listening quiet, 100 officers and 4 watching delegations absorbing, in real time, the sound of a very old certainty coming apart in public, which Mara understood, dimly, through the ringing exhaustion in her own legs, was probably a rarer thing to witness on this ship than the crack itself had been. It was Dresk, the young warrior-caste officer whose challenge she'd out-endured 2 days before, his ceremonial scars still visible along his forearms even in the deck's soft light, who broke the silence, stepping forward to the gallery rail with none of the swagger he'd carried onto the deck the last time Mara had seen him. "Overseer," he said, "if I may." Ajal inclined his head, a small permission. "I proposed a contest to Ms. Holt believing I understood exactly what strength was," Dresk said, and Mara heard, even through the translator's flat register, something raw underneath it. She showed me a category I hadn't considered. That speed was not the only measure, that endurance mattered as much as force, that a contest's rules could be read more carefully than I'd read them. I called it a failure of preparation on my part when you rebuked me, and resented the phrase for 2 days. He looked briefly at the shattered floor. I no longer resent it. I think I understand now that I have spent my whole career being strong the way the ground made easy for me to be strong, and have never once had to ask what strength looks like when the ground offers nothing at all. He turned to Mara directly, and something in his broad face, still unmistakably alien, unmistakably not human in its architecture, nonetheless carried an expression she recognized without any trouble at all, the particular, grudging respect of one working professional toward another who'd simply outthought them. "I withdraw nothing I said to you on the deck 2 days ago. I meant every word of the challenge. I withdraw only the certainty I carried into it." "Fair enough," Mara said, and something in the plainness of it, no flourish, no grand gesture, just 2 people setting down a disagreement honestly, seemed to land in the gallery with more weight than a speech would have. The treaty, when it was finally signed 3 hours later, bore almost no resemblance to the document Pen had shown her 2 nights before with a grim little margin note beside the final clause. The long descent clause was struck entirely. Ajal struck it himself, in front of witnesses, with a stylus that Mara noted, with the small distant amusement of someone still coming down off an adrenaline crash, was probably worth more than her house, and in its place, after nearly 2 hours of negotiation conducted in a side chamber off the main deck, while the gallery slowly dispersed and reassembled for the formal signing, sat a considerably shorter clause establishing something Pen. Reading it over for the 4th time, called actual equal footing, which is not a phrase I expected to get to use unironically on this trip. "They want an ongoing technical exchange," he told Mara afterward, back in the repair bay, still holding the data slate like he wasn't entirely sure it was real. Human structural engineers on a rotating basis, working alongside Vantral crews on vessels throughout the fleet. Ajal's framing it, internally, as access to what he called load-bearing intuition. The hand diagnosis thing you did on the coupling, the improvisation, all of it. He thinks it's worth more to his engineering core than any resource clause in the original draft. "They want us for our hands," Mara said, turning that over, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't mind it. "They want us," Pen said, "for exactly what you showed them on that floor, and I don't think either of us fully understands yet what that's going to be worth 5 years from now when the first rotation actually starts." He set the slate down finally and looked at her, really looked at her, the careful diplomat's assessment gone out of his face, replaced with something closer to plain, tired wonder. You know what the strangest part of my day was? It wasn't the floor. It was watching 100 aliens go completely silent because one woman from Pittsburgh walked down a flight of stairs the way she always walks downstairs. I didn't do it on purpose, Mara said, for what felt like the 10th time that day. I just walked. I know, Penn said. That's the part nobody up there is going to be able to explain to their own governments. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't a weapon. You didn't outlift anybody or outfight anybody. You just refused to change how you walked to suit their floor, and their floor turned out to be the thing that couldn't handle the truth. He shook his head slowly. 30 years in this line of work, and I've never once seen a treaty get rewritten by a footstep. Mara didn't have much of an answer to that. She sat down on the same crate she'd been sitting on all week, and flexed her hands, still raw, still faintly trembling from a morning that had asked more of her body than any single day on steel ever had, and let herself, finally, feel the ache all the way through. The deep, bone-level exhaustion of a body that had carried 2.5 times its own weight down a flight of stairs and lived, entirely, to tell about it. Ashketh found her there, still sitting on the crate, still working the ache out of her hands, and set his data slate down on the bench beside her with none of the contempt he'd carried into the bay 6 days earlier. Just a heavy-set, scored-plated officer standing quietly for a moment before he spoke. I filed my report this morning, he said, before the ceremony. I want you to know that. I certified your toolkit as functional fleet equipment 2 days ago, on the strength of the coupling readings alone, before any of this happened on the show deck. I did not wait to see which way the wager fell before I decided what was true. I appreciate that, Mara said, and meant it. I have amended the report since, Ashketh went on, to include this morning's events, though I confess I am still deciding how to phrase the relevant section. The delegate's equipment proved adequate to the task, feels insufficient, given that I watched a woman's boot do to a processional dais what nothing in 11 cycles of fleet inventory has managed. He picked the data slate back up, turning it over once in his thick hands, the same weighing gesture he'd used on her ratchet the first morning. I have spent my whole career believing that sophistication and capability were the same measurement. I am forced to admit, watching you this week, that I may have been measuring the wrong thing entirely, logging the tool's complexity, when I ought to have been logging what the hand behind it was actually capable of. Most tools are the wrong thing to measure, Mara said. It's always the hand. Ashketh considered that for a long moment, and then did something Mara hadn't expected from him, reached down, picked her ratchet up off the bench where it sat among the rest of her scattered kit, turned it over once more in the morning light, and set it back down with something that was, unmistakably, a kind of care he hadn't shown it the first time. I intend to recommend, he said, that the fleet's basic engineering curriculum include instruction in unpowered, hand-calibrated diagnosis, as a supplement to instrument reliance rather than a replacement for it. I do not expect the recommendation to be popular. I expect it to be correct, which I have found over a long career is very rarely the same thing. He inclined his head to her, formal and brief. Thank you, Ms. Holt, for the correction. It is not comfortable, at my age, to learn one has been wrong about something so foundational. I find I am grateful for it regardless. He left the bay the way he'd left it the first time, unhurried, data slate in hand, though this time he paused once more at the archway, not to look back at the toolbox with suspicion, but simply to nod once, briefly, in Mara's direction, before he disappeared down the corridor toward whichever office handled the tedious, unglamorous business of writing history down accurately after the fact. The Ashvane held station in Earth orbit for 4 more days after the signing, ostensibly to finalize logistics for the technical exchange program, though Mara suspected, by the second of those days, that at least some of the delay had less to do with logistics than with the fact that half the ship's officer corps had developed an urgent and previously non-existent interest in structural engineering. It started with small things. A junior technician named Korik, who'd laughed at her wrench the very first day alongside Rensk, turned up at the repair bay on the morning after the ceremony and asked, with a carefulness that suggested he'd rehearsed the question more than once, whether she would show him how the hand diagnosis worked, the trick of laying a palm flat against a housing and feeling for a rhythm that didn't belong. She spent an hour with him, guiding his broad, plated hand along the coupling's exterior, teaching him to feel for the half-beat stutter the way she'd feel it, and watch something shift in his face when he finally caught it. A small, private breakthrough that had nothing to do with ceremony or gravity or 11 cycles of settled reputation. Just one technician learning a new way to listen to a machine. "Your instruments will still find it faster once you know to look," she told him, "but they won't tell you to look in the first place. That's the part that's yours." Korik didn't say anything to that, but he came back the next day, and the day after, and by the fourth day there were 6 ventral technicians crowded loosely around the coupling housing at any given hour, palms pressed flat against warm alloy, arguing quietly among themselves about rhythms only Mara, at first, had been able to hear. Rensk himself took longer to come around, and when he finally did, on the 3rd day, he didn't apologize outright. Mara got the sense, watching him work up to the conversation sideways for the better part of an afternoon, that a direct apology wasn't really part of the vocabulary he had available to him. But he set her wrench down on the workbench in front of her, cleaned, the handle wrapped in a strip of fresh grip tape he'd clearly fabricated himself overnight, and said, without quite meeting her eyes, that he had taken the liberty of improving its balance, and that he hoped she did not find the alteration presumptuous. She turned it over in her hands. The balance was, in fact, better. He'd shaved a few grams off the head and redistributed the weight along the shaft in a way that made the swing feel cleaner, tighter. A small and genuinely thoughtful piece of engineering applied to a tool he'd called a farm implement 5 days earlier. "It's good work," she said, and watched something in his broad shoulders come down half an inch, the particular relief of a man who'd been braced for mockery and gotten, instead, plain professional respect. "I have never worked with a tool that had no field emitter," he admitted. "I did not understand, at first, what a person could accomplish with nothing but leverage and their own 2 hands. I understand it somewhat better now." He paused. "It is a very stupid design by our standards. It is also, I am forced to admit, elegant in the way that stupid, simple things sometimes are." "High praise," Mara said, and Rensk made the low gravel sound that was, on this ship, unmistakably a laugh, not at her expense this time but alongside her, and she found she didn't mind that one bit. Vren she saw every day, mostly in the repair bay, working alongside her on the last of the coupling's fine adjustments, with the easy, comfortable silence of 2 people who'd stopped needing to fill every quiet moment with conversation somewhere around day 3. It was Vren, on the second-to-last evening, who finally asked the question she'd been half expecting since the floor had cracked. "Did you know," he said, not looking up from the panel he was receding, "when you stepped onto the tile, did you know it would break?" Mara thought about that honestly for a moment before she answered, because she owed him an honest answer, given what he'd told her 2 nights before the ceremony, and given what he'd said out loud, in front of the whole gallery, in the silence right after the crack, that she'd never had the luxury of a world that carried her strength for her. "No," she said finally, "I knew the tile had never been tested. You told me that yourself. I filed it away the way you file away anything that might matter later, and then I walked down those stairs thinking about exactly one thing, which was not falling down, and I put my foot down the only way I know how to put a foot down, which is like I mean it. I didn't plan the crack. I just didn't plan around it either. There's a difference." Vren considered that for a long moment, turning the panel over in his hands. "On Korvath," he said eventually, "we have a saying about the difference between a soldier who wins because he calculated every variable and one who wins because he simply refused to consider losing as a variable at all. We generally regard the first kind more highly, cleverer, more controlled. He set the panel down. I am beginning to suspect we may have that backwards. Maybe, Mara said. Or maybe you need both kinds depending on the day. I did plenty of calculating this week too. Asked Dresk about the block. That got the low, private laugh out of him that she'd come to genuinely enjoy over 5 days of shared work, and they went back to the panel in the comfortable, unhurried quiet neither of them felt any need to break. The 4 visiting delegations departed one by one over the course of the 3rd and 4th days, each in its own way marking, before it went, that something aboard the HFY had shifted in a manner none of them intended to let go unremarked. The 4-eyed pair sent a formal request, through their own envoy, for a copy of whatever record existed of the ceremony, footage, testimony, the full account, citing, in language pen found almost giddy with diplomatic understatement, a desire to update their own species' extensive archive on Corvath First Contact Protocol with what they called a significant procedural anomaly. The towering delegate, who had never once left its shuttle in 5 days, sent no message at all, but its floating relay drone paused, on its way back to the shuttle bay for the final time, directly in front of Mara in the corridor outside the repair bay, hovered there for perhaps 10 full seconds with its single dark lens fixed on her, and then dipped, once in a motion that could only have been a deliberate, considered bow, before continuing on its way. Mara never did find out what species it represented, or what, exactly, it made of the whole affair, and found, oddly, that she didn't mind the mystery. It was the reed-thin delegate who sought her out properly, on the last evening before its own departure, finding her once again in the mess hall over a meal she still hadn't gotten any better at identifying. "I told you the first morning that we did not have a word for what you did," it said, folding itself down onto the bench across from her with its usual loose unfolding of too many joints. "I have spent 5 days considering the matter further, and I believe I was wrong. We do have a word. I simply did not think to reach for it because it is not usually applied to strength." "What's the word?" "The nearest translation," the delegate said, after a moment's careful consideration, "is something closer to unhurried certainty. It is the word we use for water, yes, finding its way around a stone, but it is also the word we use for a very old tree in a hard wind that does not fight the wind at all and is somehow, for that very reason, still standing when the wind is finished." It tilted its narrow head. "I do not believe Overseer Ajal understood until 5 days ago that certainty and force are not the same thing, and that a world which forges the one does not always forge the other. I suspect a great many Corvath ceremonies are about to be quietly rewritten, on ships far from this one, once word of this reaches them. I wish to tell you that before I left, because I do not think you fully understand yet how far the ripple of one broken floor is likely to travel." "I was just trying to fix a coupling," Mara said, which was, by now, close enough to a reflex that she said it almost before she'd finished thinking it. "Yes," the delegate said, and made its small clicking sound of private amusement. "I have come to understand that this is, in fact, precisely the point," and it rose, unfolded itself upright, inclined its narrow head to her one final time, and left her alone with a meal gone cold for the 2nd time that week, and a thought that stayed with her considerably longer than the first one had. On the morning of her last day aboard the HFY, Mara found Ajal in the same narrow, scuffed corridor where he'd told her, 2 nights before the ceremony, about a 19-year-old hostage ward who'd refused to fall down in front of the house that conquered his clan. He was alone again, looking out at Corvath through the same bulkhead viewport, the planet's storm-banded curve turning slow and vast in the black exactly as it had been turning 5 days earlier, indifferent to everything that had happened on the deck 2 levels up. "I find I come here more than I used to," he said, without turning, when he heard her footsteps. "I am told that is what men do when a certainty they've carried a long time finally sets itself down. They go looking for the ground it used to stand on, to see what's left there. Anything left? The planet is still there, Ajal said, and there was something almost dry in it, almost a joke, the first thing resembling humor she'd heard out of him in 5 days. The gravity is unchanged. I checked, in case it had somehow gotten the news before I did. He turned finally to face her. I have spent this week attempting to determine what I owe you, Ms. Holt, beyond the treaty terms, which Deputy Envoy Penn assures me are generous enough to satisfy any reasonable accounting. I am not certain generosity is the correct debt in this case. You don't owe me anything, Overseer. I came up here to fix a coupling. You came up here, Ajal said, and dismantled 11 cycles of doctrine with a single honest footstep, and then spent 4 more days teaching my crew to listen to their own machines with their hands, and taught one of my most difficult young officers something about strength he will carry the rest of his career, and did all of it, as far as I have been able to determine, without once asking anything of me in return beyond the chance to finish the job you were sent to do. He studied her for a long moment, in the pale reflected light off Korvath's storm bands. I am aware that on your world, this would perhaps be called simply doing one's job well. I would ask you to permit me the observation, nonetheless, that I have negotiated with 11 other species governments across 11 cycles, and none of them, in the entirety of that time, has ever managed to reorganize my understanding of my own history in under a week. Mara didn't have a ready answer to that, so she let the silence sit for a moment instead, the two of them looking out at the planet together. For what it's worth, she said finally, I don't think what happened up there means you were wrong to build something out of that morning when you were 19. You held. That's real, whatever it says about gravity. I just think you built the wrong lesson on top of a true thing, and it took a broken floor to show you the difference. She shrugged, a small, tired motion. Happens to the best foreman I ever worked under. You build a rule out of one hard morning, and it holds you up fine for years, right up until the day it doesn't, and then you've got to go find out what was actually true underneath it the whole time. And what do you believe was actually true? Ajal asked, underneath it. Mara thought about that for longer than she'd thought about most things that week. That you didn't survive that morning because your world made you hard, she said, finally. You survived it because you decided, standing there, that you weren't going to fall down in front of the people who took your home. That decision would have held on any gravity, Overseer. Yours, mine, anybody's. The floor's just a floor. It's what a person decides to do standing on it that actually counts, and I think some part of you always knew that, or you wouldn't have told me the story in the first place. Ajal was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his flat, translated voice had gone, for just a moment, unmistakably rougher at the edges than she'd ever heard it. I have not told that story to another living being in 40 cycles, he said. I am not entirely certain why I told it to you. Maybe you needed someone who wasn't going to fall down either, Mara said, to hear it. He didn't answer that directly. He looked out at Korvath a while longer, and then he reached into a fold of his plain working plating and produced a small, dense object, dark gray, unadorned, about the size of a fist, that he held out to her without ceremony. This is cut from the original processional alloy, he said. The batch specification that built every dais on every ceremonial deck in the fleet, including the one your boot went through 5 days ago. I had a technician cut a sample from the wreckage before the deck crew cleared it for disposal. I intend to have the whole batch specification revised. The fleet will build its ceremony floors, going forward, to withstand an honest step, rather than an assisted one. I thought you should have this piece, as it stood before that happened. A record of the last floor in the fleet, built for men who never had to plant their weight down themselves. Mara took it. It was heavier than it looked, cool and faintly rough-textured against her palm, one edge still showing the clean fracture line where it had sheared away from the rest of the dais. I'll put it on a shelf, she said. Next to my old work boots, probably. Those didn't survive 9 years of steel in much better shape than this did. I would like to hear about that sometime, Ajal said unexpectedly. The steel, the 40 stories. Vren tells me you have never once in 5 days fully explained what it is you actually did on your own world before any of this. It's not that interesting, Overseer. I hung beams. I bolted them together. Sometimes I welded instead. You said, on the show deck, that the alternative to getting strong was falling 40 stories, Ajal said. I have turned that sentence over more than any other thing you said to me this week. I would very much like to understand it better if the technical exchange program permits the opportunity. It permits it, Mara said. I hear they're sending human structural engineers up here on a rotating basis, starting soon. Might even be me next rotation, if the coupling doesn't hold and you need another excuse to summon a technician. The coupling will hold, Ajal said. Vren has seen to it personally twice since the ceremony. I believe he has grown somewhat protective of the repair you performed. A pause, and then, in a tone that Mara was fairly sure, even 5 days in, she was only just learning to read on his flat alien face, something wry, something almost fond, he added. He has also, I am reliably informed, taken to correcting junior technicians who mock human hand tools in the mess hall. Apparently he considers the wrench a matter of some personal pride now. Good, Mara said. It's a good wrench. Dresk found her at the shuttle bay itself, an hour before departure, while Penn was 3 consoles away finalizing the last of the logistics paperwork with the second voice and a small cluster of Vantral administrators. The young warrior caste officer stood a little apart from the rest of the send-off party, his ceremonial scars catching the hangar's overhead lighting, and when Mara caught his eye, he crossed to her without quite meeting her gaze at first, in the particular sideways approach of a man who'd rehearsed something and was still deciding whether to say it. I wish to tell you, he said finally, that I requested a place on the technical exchange rotation, the first one. I do not yet know if it will be granted. The review board has some reservations about a warrior caste officer requesting engineering assignment, which is apparently unusual, but I intend to press the matter. He paused. I would like to see, properly, what a soldier's instinct looks like on a world that has to build its strength one morning at a time, instead of inheriting it whole. You'll be bored half the time, Mara said. Most of the job's just paperwork and bad coffee. I doubt that very much, Dresk said, and there was, for the first time in 5 days, something almost like a smile in the set of his broad jaw, not the wide, gravel-laugh amusement she'd heard from Rensk and Vren, but something quieter, more private. But if I am wrong, I imagine I will learn something from the boredom too. You seem, from what I have observed, to have learned a great deal of what makes you formidable from precisely the kind of unglamorous, patient work that would bore a lesser officer half to death. That's about the nicest way anybody's ever described a decade of construction work, Mara said, and Dresk inclined his head to her, formal and unhurried, and stepped back to let the send-off party close around her for the last round of departures. The shuttle ride down was quiet, the particular quiet of 2 people who'd spent 5 days carrying more than either of them had expected to and had nothing left, for the moment, to say about it. Penn spent most of the descent with his eyes closed, not asleep, just resting, the data slate holding the finalized treaty terms clutched against his chest like a man guarding something he still couldn't quite believe he'd walked away with. Mara spent it looking out the small viewport at Earth swelling up to fill the black, blue and white and achingly familiar, and thought mostly about very little at all. Not the ceremony, not the floor, not Ajal's story about a 19-year-old hostage ward, just the plain physical relief of gravity settling back down to the one weight her whole body had ever actually known, easy as breathing after 5 days of carrying more. Debrief once they landed took longer than the ceremony itself had. A windowless room in Nevada, the same one she'd first been briefed in, now crowded with people from 3 different agencies who wanted, all of them, a slightly different version of the same story and who kept circling back. No matter how many times she explained it plainly, to some version of the question, how did you know the floor would break? As though there had to have been a plan, a calculation, some deliberate strategy behind it. Because the alternative, that she had simply walked the way she always walked, and the truth of that walk had been enough on its own, seemed to unsettle them more than an actual strategy would have. I didn't know, she told them for what felt like the 40th time, somewhere around hour 3. I told you already, I just walked. But you must have suspected. I suspected the floor hadn't been tested, Mara said. Their own engineer told me that 2 nights before. I filed it away same as I'd file away any fact that might matter. I didn't build a plan around it. I just didn't walk soft because I don't know how to walk soft. That's it. That's the whole secret. You can write that down and it'll still be true tomorrow. Nobody in the room seemed fully satisfied with that answer, which she understood, distantly, said more about the room than it did about her. Arthur Penn, for his part, sat through most of the debrief saying very little, letting the various agency officials argue among themselves about strategic implications and diplomatic precedent, and what the technical exchange program meant for interstellar relations going forward. And it wasn't until the two of them were finally released, well past dark, standing together in a parking lot under a sky that had never once, in her whole life, made her feel small the way Corvath's had, that he said the thing that actually stuck with her. You know what I keep coming back to, he said, loosening his tie for the first time all day. Every person in that room wanted a strategy, a calculation, something they could put in a manual and hand to the next person who gets sent up there. And the truest thing about what happened is that there isn't one. You can't manual your way into what you did on that floor. You either spend your whole life planting your weight down honestly, every single day, on ordinary ground nobody's watching, or you don't, and no amount of briefing prepares you for the one day it matters. He shook his head, looking up at the stars for a long moment, the ordinary human stars that didn't have a warlord's homeworld hanging vast and close among them. That's a hell of a thing to try to explain to the State Department, Mara. Don't explain it, Mara said. Just let them read the treaty terms. Terms speak for themselves. Penn laughed, tired and real, and told her he'd see her at the first exchange rotation briefing, whenever the agencies finally got around to scheduling it, and they went their separate ways in the parking lot, and Mara drove home alone, through ordinary Nevada dark, back toward a life that had, in 5 days, become somehow both entirely unchanged and completely different, in a way she suspected she'd spend a long time working out how to talk about. She didn't talk about it much in the weeks that followed. There was a version of the story that made the news sanitized, vague on details the agencies had classified, heavy on words like historic and unprecedented, and light on the actual texture of what 5 days aboard an alien warship had felt like. And she watched it exactly once, on a bar television with the sound down, and didn't recognize much of herself in it. The reporters wanted a hero. What she had to offer them was a woman who'd fixed a coupling and then walked down some stairs the way she always walked down stairs. And the gap between those two things, she found, was wide enough that most people simply filled it in with whatever version suited them better. Her crew back in Pittsburgh didn't ask her much about it either, which she was grateful for, though she suspected that had less to do with tact than with the fact that ironworkers, as a rule, don't spend a great deal of time discussing things that happened somewhere they weren't standing. She went back to the site 3 weeks after the debrief ended, back into a harness, back 40 stories up over a half-finished frame with the wind doing what the wind always did up there, and found, to her own quiet relief, that the work felt exactly the same as it always had, the beam swinging in on the crane, the 4 seconds to decide whether to call it in or reach for it herself, the particular, unglamorous satisfaction of a bolt seated true. Duda, the old foreman, retired 2 winters now but still turning up at the site twice a month out of habit, nobody had the heart to discourage, found her at lunch on her 2nd week back, sat down across from her on an overturned bucket with the same deliberate slowness he'd always had, and studied her for a while without saying anything. "Heard you went up and broke an alien's floor," he said finally. "Something like that. They tell you how." "Told them I just walked." Duda nodded slowly, chewing on that along with his sandwich, and said, after a while, in the particular gravel-dry tone she'd been hearing out of him since she was 19 years old and terrified on her first beam, "Careful gets you killed up here. Certain keeps you alive." He looked at her for a long moment. "Guess that goes further than I figured it did." "Guess it does," Mara said, and that was, more or less, the whole conversation, and it was, she thought afterward, exactly the conversation she'd needed to have about the whole thing. No fanfare. No explanation that actually explained anything. Just an old man who taught her how to trust a beam, confirming, in his own flat way, that the lesson had held up further from home than either of them had ever expected it to travel. The first technical exchange rotation landed at a research facility outside Houston 4 months later, and Mara only found out Vren had been assigned to it when a government liaison she'd never met called her directly, sounding faintly harried, to ask whether she'd be willing to host a site visit. The Vantral engineer, apparently, had specifically requested to see, in his own words, the kind of work that builds a person's strength one morning at a time, and had named her by name as the person he wanted to see it from. She cleared it with her foreman, who didn't ask many questions beyond whether the alien would need a hard hat, and 3 days later found herself standing at the base of a half-finished frame 12 stories up, waiting for a government convoy to deliver, of all things, a Vantral engineer to a construction site in downtown Pittsburgh. Vren arrived in civilian clothes rather than plating, which took her a moment to adjust to, a plain gray jacket that had clearly been tailored by someone who'd never quite gotten a Vantral's proportions right, broad shoulders straining the seams, and an expression, when he stepped out of the convoy vehicle and looked up at the frame rising above him, that she recognized immediately, because she'd worn something close to it herself, 5 months earlier. Stepping off a shuttle onto an alien flagship for the first time. "It's taller than I expected," he said, tipping his head back to take in the full height of the frame, his voice sounding strange to her without the flat translator register, run instead through a small earpiece device that rendered it slightly less mechanical, slightly more his own. "Wait till you're up on it," Mara said. He went pale, or did whatever the Vantral equivalent of going pale was, a faint graying along the plated ridges of his jaw, and asked, with what she was fairly sure was genuine alarm, whether that was actually part of the visit. "Only if you want it to be," she said. "Nobody's making you climb anything, Vren. This isn't the show deck. Nobody up here's keeping score." He considered that for a long moment, looking up at the frame again, and then, to her genuine surprise, said that he would, in fact, like to try, carefully, with a harness and only partway up. But he wanted to feel it, he said, the thing she described to Ajal in the corridor outside the bulkhead viewport, the 4 seconds a person gets to decide whether to reach for the beam or call it in. She rigged him a harness herself, checked every buckle twice the way she'd have checked it for any new hire, and walked him up the first 3 stories at a pace slow enough that his legs, adjusted his whole life to 2.5 times Earth's gravity, wouldn't get ahead of his nerve. He moved carefully at first, testing his own weight against Earth's gravity with the exaggerated caution of a man convinced, on some deep instinctive level, that a world this soft beneath his boots couldn't possibly hold him up properly. And then, partway up the second flight of temporary stairs bolted to the frame's exterior, something shifted in his stance, some old Vantral instinct catching up to the plain physical fact that Earth's gravity, however weak by his homeworld standards, was still gravity, still solid, still entirely capable of holding a body's weight exactly the way any gravity does. "It feels like nothing," he said, once they'd reached the 3rd-story platform and stopped, both of them a little out of breath, him considerably less than she'd expected. "I keep bracing for weight that isn't there." That's the thing nobody up on your ship ever had to learn, Mara said. Your bodies grew up expecting the ground to fight you. Down here, the ground barely pushes back at all. Doesn't mean the work's easy. Just means the gravity's not the part doing the work anymore. You've got to build the strength yourself, the old-fashioned way, same as I did, because the planet sure isn't going to hand it to you. Vren looked out over the half-built skyline, the ordinary human city spread out under an ordinary human sky, and was quiet for a long moment. Ajal asked me before I left to tell you something, he said, finally. He has begun revising the fleet's ceremonial protocols in earnest, not just the long descent, all of them, every ritual built on the old assumption that a strong world produces strong people by default. It is slow work. 11 cycles of doctrine does not unwind in 4 months, but he wished you to know that he thinks of the corridor conversation often, the one about the difference between what a person survives and what a person decides while surviving it. He said to tell you he has started teaching it to his junior officers in those words, more or less. He credits you for the phrasing. I believe, in his own way, that is the closest thing to a formal honor Korvath has to offer. Tell him I said thanks, Mara said, and tell him he still owes me a rematch on the 400-kilo block if he ever gets bored enough to visit. Vren made the low gravel sound of a laugh, genuinely delighted, and told her he would pass that along exactly as she'd said it, word for word, and Mara believed him. They spent the rest of the afternoon on the ground, Vren peppering her with questions about welding tolerances and bolt torque specifications, and the load calculations she did in her head without a second thought. Questions that reminded her, more than once, of Rensk's slow, grudging conversion from mockery to genuine professional curiosity 5 months earlier, except that Vren had never needed converting in the first place. He'd been curious from the very first day in the repair bay, when everyone else on that crew had been laughing. "Can I ask you something?" he said, toward the end of the afternoon, as the crew began wrapping tools for the day and the light went long and gold across the half-finished frame. "Do you resent it? What Ajal put you through? The whole ceremony, the ritual, the 11 cycles of assumption you had to break through a floor to answer." Mara thought about that seriously, coiling a length of cable as she considered it, because it deserved a real answer rather than a reflexive one. "No," she said finally, "not really. I think he built something out of a true fear, same as anybody does, and it took him a long time and 100 witnesses to see the fear clearly enough to let it go. That's not nothing. Doing that in front of a whole gallery takes more nerve than most people ever find." She set the coiled cable down and looked at Vren directly. "What I resent, if I resent anything, is how many delegations went through that ceremony before me and just fell. Never got the chance to find out what they were actually made of, because nobody ever built them a floor that would let them prove it. That's the part that sits wrong with me. Not what happened to me. What almost never got the chance to happen at all." Vren was quiet for a while, turning that over. "I think," he said eventually, "that is precisely the part Ajal has spent 4 months trying to fix." "Good," Mara said. "That's the part worth fixing." The convoy came for Vren a little before sunset, and he lingered a moment at the vehicle's door, looking back up at the frame one more time, gold light catching along its raw steel bones. "I would like to come back," he said. "Properly. Climb higher than the 3rd story, once my legs trust the ground a little more." "Any time," Mara said. "Bring a hard hat that actually fits you next time. And tell your supply officers a vantral-sized harness isn't that hard to spec. I had to jury-rig yours out of 2 human ones." "I will submit the requisition personally," Vren said, with the particular gravity of a man who fully intended to make it his life's mission, and climbed into the convoy vehicle, and was gone, and Mara stood alone at the base of the frame for a while after the vehicle had pulled away, looking up at 12 stories of raw steel against a sky that had never once needed to prove itself weak or strong to anybody, and thought that Ajal, whatever else was true about him, had been right about one thing all along, even if he'd gotten the lesson backwards for 11 cycles before a broken floor set him straight, that gravity told you something in the end. Just not the thing he'd always assumed it told you. Her mother, when Mara finally drove out to see her 2 weekends after the debrief, wanted to know exactly one thing above everything else in the sanitized government summary the family liaison had walked her through over the phone. And it wasn't the treaty, or the ceremony, or the 11 cycles of doctrine, or any of the parts that had occupied 3 different federal agencies for the better part of a week. "They fed you," she said, standing in her kitchen with her arms crossed, in the tone of a woman who had raised a daughter alone on a welder's schedule and had opinions about every meal that child had ever skipped. "Some kind of gray paste. For 5 days. And you're telling me that's all they had?" "It wasn't terrible, Ma." "It wasn't terrible," her mother repeated, in the flat, dangerous tone of a woman who had heard her daughter describe far worse things as not terrible over the years, and had learned to distrust the phrase entirely. "You went up on an alien spaceship, broke their floor in front of 100 witnesses, and the thing you're worried I'll be upset about is the food." "I'm not worried about anything, Ma. I'm just telling you the food part wasn't the hard part." Her mother studied her for a long moment across the kitchen, the particular unhurried, assessing look she'd been giving Mara since she was 17 years old, and announcing, over a different kitchen table, that she'd taken a job hanging steel instead of finishing the community college program everyone had assumed she'd finish. "You look tired," she said finally, in a different voice, softer, and pulled a chair out for her at the table without waiting for an answer, and put a plate in front of her that had nothing whatsoever gray or pasty about it. And Mara ate it in the particular grateful silence of someone who had, in fact, been more tired than she'd let herself admit to anyone in a federal debrief room, and found that some things a mother, a kitchen, an ordinary Tuesday dinner, traveled the distance between a repair bay on an alien flagship and a row house in Pittsburgh, a great deal better than she'd expected. The broader ripple the reed-thin delegate had promised her, on the last evening before its departure, took longer to arrive than 4 months, but it arrived nonetheless, in pieces, through Penn, who kept a line open to her for exactly this purpose, and called every few weeks with updates delivered in the dry, faintly amazed tone of a man who had spent 30 years in diplomacy, and was still adjusting to the idea that any of this was real. The Four-Eyed Delegation's government, it turned out, had opened formal review proceedings on its own first contact protocols within 6 weeks of receiving the reed-thin envoy's account of the ceremony. Not because they'd ever run anything quite like the long descent themselves, Penn explained, but because the underlying assumption, the idea that a homeworld's gravity or climate or resource scarcity told you the whole of what a species could become, turned out to be baked into a surprising number of galactic protocols that nobody had ever quite gotten around to questioning, until a human ironworker had questioned one of them with her boot. "They're calling it, apparently, the Holt correction," Penn told her over the phone with the particular relish of a man delivering a punchline he'd been saving. "In at least 2 languages I can't pronounce. I want you to sit with that for a second. There is a term of art now, in interstellar diplomatic circles, named after you, and it refers to the general principle that you shouldn't assume you know what a species is capable of until you've actually watched them try." "That's a mouthful for don't judge a book by its cover," Mara said. "Diplomats get paid by the word, Mara. We can't just say the plain version. It looks unserious on a letterhead." She laughed at that genuinely, and told him to keep the updates coming, and he did, every few weeks, a steady trickle of small far-off consequences from a single footstep on a ship she'd never expected to set foot on in the first place. A research consortium, 3 systems over, revising its first contact assessment criteria to include what its own translated documentation called demonstrated resilience under load, rather than presumed resilience from origin conditions. A junior diplomat from some species Mara had never heard of and never would meet, citing the Ashvin ceremony in a formal address as a reason his own government should stop assuming smaller, softer-seeming delegations had nothing worth negotiating over. None of it changed her daily life very much. She still went up on steel 4 days a week, still ate dinner with her mother most Sundays, still argued with her foreman about scheduling the way she always had. But she found over those months that she carried the knowledge of it somewhere quiet and steady in the back of her mind. Not pride, exactly, nothing so loud as that, just the plain, settled fact that something she'd done without planning to, simply by walking the way she always walked, had traveled further than she would ever personally go, and had left the world it traveled through very slightly, permanently different. Ajul himself came to Earth 11 months after the ceremony, at the head of a formal delegation marking the first full year of the technical exchange program, and insisted, against the strong and repeated objections of his own security detail, on a single unscheduled stop before the formal state visit began, a half-finished frame on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, 12 stories and climbing, where a woman he'd once told, flatly, that her world was the weakest first contact world on record, stood waiting for him at the base of the scaffolding in a hard hat and a work jacket that had never once, in her life, been tailored for anyone's approval. He moved carefully across the site, in civilian clothes like Vren's had been, his broad frame drawing the kind of stares from her crew that she remembered, distantly, feeling herself. The first time she'd stood in a repair bay full of Vantral technicians, and understood, in a low, physical way, exactly how far from home she was. He stopped a few feet from her and looked up, the same way Vren had, at the raw steel bones rising against an ordinary blue sky, and was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. "I did not come merely for the state visit," he said. "I came because I found, 11 months on, that I still owed you a conversation I have been putting off, and I have learned this past year that putting things off is a habit that costs more than it saves." "You don't owe me anything, Overseer. Told you that already." "I know you believe that," Ajul said. "I have come to believe you are wrong, though I doubt I will convince you of it today." He looked around the site, the crane swinging a beam into place 200 feet away, the crew calling numbers back and forth in the particular clipped shorthand of men who'd worked together long enough not to need full sentences, the ordinary, unglamorous churn of a building slowly becoming a building. "This is what you meant that first week, earning what you carry." "This is it," Mara said. "Nothing fancier than this, just steel and bolts and a lot of mornings." Ajul watched the crane a while longer, the beam settling into place with a distant, metallic clang that carried across the site, and something in his broad, flat face, a year removed now from the man who'd stood over a shattered ceremonial floor with his hand halfway to his own chest, had settled into something calmer, more at ease with itself, though she could still see, underneath it, the shape of the question that had first brought him down that scuffed corridor to talk to her about a 19-year-old hostage ward. "I have revised the long descent," he said finally. "It no longer exists in its old form. I have replaced it, for every first contact ceremony going forward, with something considerably less theatrical and considerably more honest, a simple, plainly stated invitation for the visiting delegation to demonstrate whatever skill their own world has actually asked of them, on their own terms, without a gravity field designed to make the outcome a foregone conclusion. It is a smaller ceremony, less impressive to a gallery. I have had complaints from officers who preferred the old spectacle." He paused. "I do not care for their complaints. I have found I no longer particularly wish to build my ship's diplomacy around watching strangers fall down." "Good," Mara said simply, and meant it, and Ajul inclined his head to her, the same unhurried, deliberate gesture he'd given her a year before at the base of a shattered dais, and the two of them stood together for a while longer at the base of an ordinary construction site, an old alien warlord and a young human ironworker, watching a beam swing slowly into place under a gravity neither of them needed any more to prove anything at all. The crane finished setting the beam, and the site foreman called down for a 15-minute break, and Ajul's security detail, visibly relieved to have made it through an unscheduled stop without incident, began making the particular polite, urgent noises of people who needed to get their principal back on schedule for the actual state visit. Ajul ignored them for a moment longer, watching the crew scatter toward the water cooler and the shade of the site trailer with the loose, unhurried ease of people who did this every day, and had long since stopped finding any of it remarkable. "May I ask you one more thing," he said, "before I am reclaimed by my own itinerary?" "Go ahead. Do you still have it? The piece of the floor?" Mara reached into her jacket pocket and pulled it out. She'd taken to carrying it. She realized only when he asked, more dazed than not. The small, dense chunk of dark gray processional alloy worn smooth now along one edge from a year of riding in her pocket alongside a torque wrench and a folding rule. She held it out to him, and he took it, turning it over once in his broad, plated hand, tracing the clean fracture line with one thick finger the way she'd trace a bad weld. "I had wondered whether you'd kept it as a trophy," he said, handing it back. "I find I am relieved to learn it is something closer to a tool. You use it the way you use everything else, apparently, to remember what a floor actually is, rather than what a ceremony pretended it was." "Something like that," Mara said, pocketing it again. "Mostly I just like having a piece of the job in my pocket. Same reason I kept a bent nail from my first week on steel for about 6 years, until I finally lost it moving apartments. You keep the ugly little pieces. They're the ones that actually tell you something." Ajul considered that and then, unexpectedly, reached into his own coat, tailored properly this time, by someone who'd clearly learned Evantral's proportions since Vren's first ill-fitting jacket, and produced a small dark object of his own, which he held out to her without ceremony. A fragment of stone, rough and unpolished, dense the way volcanic rock runs dense, small enough to close a fist around. "From the ridge above the northern holding," he said, "the house that conquered my clan when I was 19. I have carried a piece of it for 40 cycles in one pocket or another, and I never told anyone why because I was not entirely certain myself, until a year ago, when a woman from a soft world explained it back to me more plainly than I had ever managed on my own." He set it in her palm, closing her fingers around it gently. "I would like you to have it, not as a trophy. As a tool, the way you use yours, something ugly and small that tells you what actually happened. So the ceremony you build on top of it, if you ever build one, gets built on the truth instead of the fear." Mara turned the stone over in her palm, dense and rough and cool, a fragment of a mountain range on a world she would probably never see again, carried 40 cycles by a man who had, that morning, stood at the base of a half-finished building in Pittsburgh, and watched a crane swing a beam into place under a gravity he no longer needed to survive to prove anything. "I'll keep it next to the wrench," she said. "That seems appropriate," Ajul said, and something in his broad, flat face for just a moment was as close to a smile as she'd ever seen it come. His security detail finally won the argument about the schedule, and the delegation's convoy pulled out a few minutes later. Ajul's window rolled halfway down as the vehicle eased past the site gate, one broad hand raised in a gesture that wasn't quite a wave and wasn't quite a salute, something in between that Mara found she didn't need a word for, and then the convoy was gone, and the site noise closed back in around her. The crane's engine idling. Someone's radio playing something with too much bass for the foreman's taste. The ordinary churn of a Tuesday afternoon on a job that didn't care, and had never once cared, what any of it meant to anyone standing 40 stories below the sky. She kept both stones, the sheared gray vantral alloy, and the dense volcanic fragment from a ridge on a world called Korvath, on the same narrow shelf above her workbench where she'd once told Ajul she'd put them, next to a pair of boots too worn through to wear anymore and a bent nail she'd found, eventually, months after she thought she'd lost the first one, tangled in the lining of an old work bag. She didn't display them. Nobody who came through her apartment would have picked them out as anything more than 2 ugly rocks a woman with a construction habit had picked up somewhere along the way, and that suited her fine. The people who needed to know what they were already knew, and the people who didn't were welcome to ask, and mostly didn't, because Mara Holt had never once, in her whole life, been the kind of person who volunteered a story before someone asked her for it directly. Duda asked her about it once more, the following spring, on a lunch break with the frame finally topped out and the crew starting the long, unglamorous work of closing it in. The part of a job, she'd told Vren once, that never made the news, the part where a building stopped being a skeleton and started being a place somebody could actually live. "They ever come back?" Duda asked, around a mouthful of sandwich, nodding vaguely skyward in the general direction of wherever a person nodded when they meant the whole rest of the universe. "Every so often," Mara said. "Got a young engineer who wants to climb higher than the 3rd story next visit. Overseer stopped by last fall, brought me a rock." "A rock? Long story." Duda considered that with the particular unhurried patience of a man who had heard a great many long stories over a great many lunch breaks and had learned decades ago that most of them weren't worth chasing if the person telling them didn't want to tell it yet. "You ever think about it?" he said instead. "What would have happened if that floor hadn't broken? If you just walked down those stairs and nothing had happened at all, no crack, no crowd going quiet, none of it. You'd have still walked it the same way. Same boots, same weight, same everything. Only difference is nobody would have noticed." Mara turned that over for a while, chewing, looking out over the half-closed-in frame rising against an ordinary sky that had never once needed a crowd to make it real. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted, "and I think the answer's simple enough, even if it took me a while to see it. It wouldn't have mattered whether the floor broke or not. Either way, I was still going to walk down those stairs exactly the same. The floor breaking didn't make what I did true. It just made it visible to a room full of people who needed to see it to believe it." She looked at Duda, and something in the old foreman's weathered face told her he'd already known the answer before he asked the question, the way old foremen usually did. "That's the part I keep coming back to. The walking was always the real thing. The crack was just the world finally catching up to it." Duda nodded slowly, satisfied, and didn't say anything else about it, and went back to his sandwich, and the two of them sat together a while longer in the ordinary spring sun, 40 feet up on a half-finished frame that would, in a few more months, be a building full of people who would never once think about the particular weight of every bolt holding the floor beneath their feet, or the particular certainty it had taken to seat every one of them true. Somewhere out past the edge of that ordinary sky, on a ship called the HFY orbiting a world she'd never see again, a floor that had been rebuilt to withstand an honest step held steady under officers who no longer needed a ceremony to tell them what they were made of, and 40 stories below an ordinary Pittsburgh sky. Mara Holt finished her sandwich, picked her wrench back up off the toolbox beside her, and went back to work, the way she always had, the way she always would. One honest step at a time, on ground that had never once handed her anything for free, and had never once needed to.